Section 19 of A Budget of Christmas Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Glennie Junkin, St. Charles, Missouri. Widow Townsend's Visitor. The fire crackled cheerfully on the broad hearth of an old-fashioned fireplace in an old-fashioned public house in an old-fashioned village down in that part of the Old Dominion called the Eastern Shore. A cat and 3 kittens basked in the warmth, and a decrepit yellow dog, lying full in the reflection of the blaze, wrinkled his black nose approvingly as he turned his hind feet where his forefeet had been. Over the chimney hung several fine hams and pieces of dried beef. Apples were festooned along the ceiling, and other signs of plenty and good cheer were scattered profusely about. There were plants, too, on the window ledges, horseshoe geraniums and dew plants, and a monthly rose just budding, to say nothing of pots of violets that perfumed the whole place whenever they took it into their purple heads to bloom. The floor was carefully swept. The chairs had not a speck of dust upon leg or round. The long settle near the fireplace shone as if it had been just varnished, and the 8-day clock in the corner had had its white face newly washed and seemed determined to tick the louder for it. 2 armchairs were drawn up at cozy distance from the hearth and each other. A candle, a newspaper, a pair of spectacles, a dish of red-cheeked apples, and a pitcher of cider filled a little table between them. In one of these chairs sat a comfortable-looking woman about 45, with cheeks as red as the apples and eyes as dark and bright as they had ever been, resting her elbow on the table and her head upon her hand and looking thoughtfully into the fire. This was Widow Townsend, relict of Mr. Levi Townsend, who had been moldering into dust in the neighboring churchyard for 7 years and more. She was thinking of her dead husband, possibly because all her work being done and the servant gone to bed, the sight of his empty chair at the other side of the table and the silence of the room made her a little lonely. 7 years, so the widow's reverie ran. It seems as if it were more than 50, and Christmas nigh here again, and yet I don't look so very old neither. Perhaps it's not having any children to bother my life out as other people have. They may say what they like. Children are more plague than profit, that's my opinion. Look at my sister Jerusha with her 6 boys. She's worn to a shadow, and I'm sure they have done it, though she never will own it. The widow took an apple from the dish and began to peel it. How fond Mr. Townsend used to be of these apples. He'll never eat any more of them, poor fellow, for I don't suppose they have apples where he has gone to. Hey-ho! I remember very well how I used to throw apple peel over my head when I was a girl to see who I was going to marry. Mrs. Townsend stopped short and blushed, for in those days she did not know Mr. T. and was always looking eagerly to see if the peel had formed a capital S. Her meditations took a new turn. How handsome Sam Payson was, and how much I used to care about him. I wonder what has become of him. Jerusha says he went away from our village just after I did, and no one has ever heard of him since. What a silly thing that quarrel was. If it had not been for that— Here came a long pause, during which the widow looked very steadfastly at the empty armchair of Levi Townsend, deceased. Her fingers played carelessly with the apple peel. She drew it safely towards her and looked around the room. Upon my word, it is very ridiculous, and I don't know what the neighbors would say if they saw me. Still the plump fingers drew the red peel nearer. But then they can't see me, that's a comfort, and the cat and old Bose never will know what it means. Of course, I don't believe anything about it. The peel hung gracefully from her hand. But still, I should like to try. It would seem like old times, and— Over her head it went, and curled up quietly on the floor at a little distance. Old Bose, who always slept with one eye open, saw it fall and marched deliberately up to smell it. "Bose! Bose, don't touch!" cried his mistress, and bending over it with beating heart, she turned as red as fire. There was as handsome a capital S as anyone could wish to see. A great knock came suddenly at the door. Bose growled, and the widow screamed and snatched up the apple peel. "It's Mr. T. It's his spirit come back again because I tried that silly trick," she thought fearfully to herself. Another knock, louder than the first, and a man's voice exclaimed, "Hello, the house." "Who is it?" asked the widow, somewhat relieved to find that the departed Levi was still safe in his grave on the hillside. "A stranger," said the voice. "What do you want?" "To get a lodging here for the night." The widow deliberated. "Can't you go on? There's a house half a mile farther if you keep to the right side of the road and turn to the left after you get by—" "It's raining cats and dogs, and I'm very delicate," said the stranger, coughing. "I'm wet to the skin. Don't you think you can accommodate me? I don't mind sleeping on the floor." "Raining, is it? I didn't know that." And the kind-hearted little woman unbarred the door very quickly. "Come in, whoever you may be. I only asked you to go on because I'm a lone woman with only one servant in the house." The stranger entered, shaking himself like a Newfoundland dog upon the step, and scattering a little shower of drops over his hostess and her nicely swept floor. "Ah, that looks comfortable after a man has been out for hours in a storm," he said as he caught sight of the fire, and striding along toward the hearth, followed by Bose, who sniffed suspiciously at his heels, he stationed himself in the armchair, Mr. Townsend's armchair, which had been kept sacred to his memory for 7 years. The widow was horrified, but her guest looked so weary and worn out that she could not ask him to move, but busied herself in stirring up the blaze that he might the sooner dry his dripping clothes. A new thought struck her. Mr. T. had worn a comfortable dressing-gown during his illness, which still hung in the closet at her right. She could not let this poor man catch his death by sitting in that wet coat. If he was in Mr. Townsend's chair, why should he not be in Mr. Townsend's wrapper? She went nimbly to the closet, took it down, fished out a pair of slippers from a boot-rack below, and brought them to him. "I think you had better take off your coat and boots. You will have the rheumatic fever or something like it if you don't. Here are some things for you to wear while they are drying, and you must be hungry too. I will go into the pantry and get you something to eat." She bustled away on hospitable thoughts intent, and the stranger made the exchange with a quizzical smile playing around his lips. He was a tall, well-formed man, with a bold but handsome face, sunburned and heavily bearded, and looking anything but delicate, though his blue eyes glanced out from under a forehead as white as snow. He looked around the kitchen with a mischievous air and stretched out his feet decorated with the defunct Boniface's slippers. "Upon my word, this is stepping into the old man's shoes with a vengeance. And what a hearty, good-humored-looking woman she is, kind as a kitten." And he leaned forward and stroked the cat in her brood, and then patted old Bose upon the head. The widow, bringing in sundry good things, looked pleased at his attention to her dumb friends. "It's a wonder Bose does not growl. He generally does if strangers touch him. Dear me, how stupid!" The last remark was neither addressed to the stranger nor to the dog, but to herself. She had forgotten that the little stand was not empty, and there was no room on it for the things she held. "Oh, I'll manage it," said her guest, gathering up paper, candle, apples, and spectacles. It was not without a little pang that she saw them in his hand, for they had been her husband's and were placed each night, like the armchair, beside her, and depositing them on the settle. "Give me the tablecloth, ma'am. I can spread it as well as any woman. I've learned that, along with scores of other things in my wanderings. Now let me relieve you of those dishes. They are far too heavy for those hands." The widow blushed. "And now, please, sit down with me, or I cannot eat a morsel." "I had supper long ago, but really I think I can take something more," said Mrs. Townsend, drawing her chair nearer to the table. "Of course you can, my dear lady. In this cold fall weather, people ought to eat twice as much as they do in warm. Let me give you a piece of this ham, your own curing, I dare say." "Yes, my poor husband was very fond of it. He used to say that no one understood curing ham and drying beef better than I." "He was a most sensible man, I am sure. I drink your health, ma'am, in this cider." He took a long draught and set down his glass. It is like nectar." The widow was feeding Bose and the cat, who thought they were entitled to a share of every meal eaten in the house, and did not quite hear what he said. "Fine dog, ma'am, and a very pretty cat." "They were my husband's favorites," and a sigh followed the answer. "Ah, your husband must have been a very happy man." The blue eyes looked at her so long that she grew flurried. "Is there anything more I can get for you, sir?" she asked at last. "Nothing, thank you. I have finished." She rose to clear the things away. He assisted her, and somehow their hands had a queer knack of touching as they carried the dishes to the pantry shelves. Coming back to the kitchen, she put the apples and cider in their old places, and brought out a clean pipe and a box of tobacco from an arched recess near the chimney. "My husband always said he could not sleep after eating supper late unless he smoked," she said. "Perhaps you would like to try it." "Not if it is to drive you away," he answered, for she had her candle in her hand. "Oh, no, I do not object to smoke at all." She put the candle down. Some faint suggestion about propriety troubled her, but she glanced at the old clock and felt reassured. It was only 9:30. The stranger pushed the stand back after the pipe was lit, and drew her easy chair a little nearer the fire and his own. "Come, sit down," he said pleadingly. "It's not late, and when a man has been knocking about in California and all sorts of places for a score of years, he is glad enough to get into a berth like this, and to have a pretty woman to speak to once again." "California? Have you been in California?" she exclaimed, dropping into the chair at once. Unconsciously, she had long cherished the idea that Sam Payson, the lover of her youth, with whom she had so foolishly quarreled, had pitched his tent after many wanderings in that far-off land. Her heart warmed to one who, with something of Sam's looks and ways about him, had also been sojourning in that country, and who very possibly had met him, perhaps had known him intimately. At that thought her heart beat quick, and she looked very graciously at the bearded stranger, who, wrapped in Mr. Townsend's dressing gown, wearing Mr. Townsend's slippers, and sitting in Mr. Townsend's chair beside Mr. Townsend's wife, smoked Mr. Townsend's pipe with such an air of feeling most thoroughly and comfortably at home. "Yes, ma'am, I've been in California for the last 6 years, and before that I went quite round the world in a whaling ship." "Good gracious!" The stranger sent a puff of smoke curling gracefully over his head. "It's very strange, my dear lady, how often you see one thing as you go wandering about the world after that fashion." "And what is that?" "Men without house or home above their heads, roving here and there, and turning up in all sorts of odd places, caring very little for life as a general thing, and making fortunes, just to fling them away again, and all for one reason. You don't ask me what that is? No doubt you know already very well." "I think not, sir." "Because a woman has jilted them." Here was a long pause, and Mr. Townsend's pipe emitted short puffs with surprising rapidity. A guilty conscience needs no accuser, and the widow's cheek was dyed with blushes as she thought of the absent Sam. "I wonder how women manage when they get served in the same way," said the stranger musingly. "You never meet them roaming up and down in that style." "No," said Mrs. Townsend with some spirit. "If a woman is in trouble, she must stay at home and bear it the best way she can. And there's more women bearing such things than we know of, I dare say." "Like enough. We never know whose hand gets pinched in a trap unless they scream. And women are too shy or too sensible, which you choose, for that." "Did you ever in all your wanderings meet anyone by the name of Samuel Payson?" asked the widow unconcernedly. The stranger looked toward her. She was rummaging the table drawer for her knitting work and did not notice him. When it was found and the needles in motion, he answered her. "Payson? Sam Payson? Why, he was my most intimate friend. Do you know him?" "A little, that is, I used to when I was a girl. Where did you meet him?" "He went with me on the whaling voyage I told you of, and afterward to California. We had a tent together, and some other fellows with us, and we worked the same claim for more than 6 months." "I suppose he was quite well?" "Strong as an ox." "And And happy?" pursued the widow, bending closer over her knitting.
The less said about that, the better, perhaps. But he seemed to enjoy life after a fashion of his own, and he got rich out there, or rather, I will say, well off."
Mrs. Townsend did not pay much attention to that part of the story. Evidently, she had not finished asking questions, but she was puzzled about her next one. At last, she brought it out beautifully. "Was his wife with him in California?" The stranger looked at her with twinkling eyes.
"His wife, ma'am? Why, bless you, he has not got any wife."
"Oh, I heard." Here the little widow remembered the fate of Ananias and Sapphira, and stopped short before she told such a tremendous fib.
"Whatever you heard of his marrying was all nonsense, I can assure you. I knew him well, and he had no thoughts of the kind about him. Some of the boys used to tease him about it, but he soon made them stop."
"How?"
"He just told them frankly that the only woman he ever loved had jilted him years before and married another man. After that, no one ever mentioned the subject to him, except me."
Mrs. Townsend laid her knitting aside and looked thoughtfully into the fire.
"He was another specimen of the class of men I was speaking of. I have seen him face death a score of times as quietly as I face the fire. 'It matters very little what takes me off,' he used to say. 'I've nothing to live for, and there's no one that will shed a tear for me when I'm gone.' It's a sad thought for a man to have, isn't it?"
Mrs. Townsend sighed as she said she thought it was. "But did he ever tell you the name of the woman who jilted him?"
"I know her first name."
"What was it?"
"Maria."
The plump little widow almost started out of her chair. The name was spoken so exactly as Sam would have said it.
"Did you know her too?" he asked, looking keenly at her.
"Yes."
"Intimately?"
"Yes."
"Where is she now? Still happy with her husband, I suppose, and never giving a thought to the poor fellow she drove out into the world?"
"No," said Mrs. Townsend, shading her face with her hand and speaking unsteadily. "No, her husband is dead."
"Ah, but still she never thinks of Sam."
There was a dead silence.
"Does she?"
"How can I tell?"
"Are you still friends?"
"Yes."
"Then you ought to know, and you do. Tell me."
"I'm sure I don't know why I should. But if I do, you must promise me on your honor never to tell him if you ever meet him again."
"Madam, what you say to me never shall be repeated to any mortal man, upon my honor."
"Well, then, she does remember him."
"But how?"
"As kindly, I think, as he could wish."
"I am glad to hear it for his sake. You and I are the friends of both parties. We can rejoice with each other."
He drew his chair much nearer hers and took her hand. One moment the widow resisted, but it was a magnetic touch. The rosy palm lay quietly in his, and the dark beard bent so low that it nearly touched her shoulder. It did not matter much. Was he not Samuel's dear friend? If he was not the rose, had he not dwelt very near it for a long, long time?
"It was a foolish quarrel that parted them," said the stranger softly.
"Did he tell you about it?"
"Yes, on board the whaler."
"Did he blame her much?"
"Not so much as himself. He said that his jealousy and ill temper drove her to break off the match. But he thought sometimes that if he had only gone back and spoken kindly to her, she would have married him after all."
"I am sure she would," said the widow piteously. "She has owned it to me more than 1,000 times."
"She was not happy then with another."
That is to say, her husband was very good and kind," said the little woman, thinking of the lonely grave out on the hillside rather penitently. "And they lived very pleasantly together. There never was a harsh word between them."
"Still, might she not have been happier with Sam? Be honest now, and say just what you think."
"Yes."
"Bravo! That is what I wanted to come at. And now I have a secret to tell you, and you must break it to her."
Mrs. Townsend looked rather scared. "What is it?"
"I want you to go and see her, wherever she may be, and say to her, 'Maria.' What makes you start so?"
"Nothing, only you speak so like someone I used to know once in a while."
"Do I? Well, take the rest of the message. Tell her that Sam loved her through the whole, that when he heard she was free, he began to work hard at making a fortune. He has got it, and he is coming to share it with her, if she will let him. Will you tell her this?"
The widow did not answer. She had freed her hand from his and covered her face with it. By and by she looked up again. He was waiting patiently.
"Well?"
"I will tell her." He rose from his seat and walked up and down the room. Then he came back and, leaning on the mantelpiece, stroked the yellow hide of Bose with his slipper.
"Make her understand that he wants her for his wife. She may live where she likes and how she likes, only it must be with him."
"I will tell her."
"Say he has grown old, but not cold, that he loves her now perhaps better than he did 20 years ago, that he has been faithful to her all through his life, and that he will be faithful till he dies."
The Californian broke off suddenly. The widow answered still, "I will tell her."
"And what do you think she will say?"
he asked in an altered tone. "What can she say but come?"
"Hooray!"
The stranger caught her out of her chair as if she had been a child and kissed her. "Don't! Oh, don't!" she cried out. "I am Sam's Maria."
"Well, I am Maria's Sam."
Off went the dark wig and the black whiskers. There smiled the dear face she had not forgotten. I leave you to imagine the tableau. Even the cat got up to look, and Bo sat on his stump of a tail and wondered if he was on his heels or his head. The widow gave one little scream, and then But stop! Quiet people like you and me, dear reader, who have got over all these follies and can do nothing but turn up our noses at them, have no business here. I will only add that two hearts were very happy, that Bose concluded after a while that all was right, and so lay down to sleep again, and that 1 week afterward, on Christmas Eve, there was a wedding at the house that made the neighbors stare. The widow had married her first love. End of section 19. Recording by Glennie Junkin, St. Charles, Missouri.
Section 20 of A Budget of Christmas Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Giordano. The Old Man's Christmas by Ella Wheeler Wilcox. Part 1. Though there was wrong on both sides, they never would have separated had it not been for the old man. He was Ben's father, and Ben was an only child, a spoiled, selfish, high-tempered lad who had grown up with the idea that his father, Anson English, or the old man, as his dutiful son called him, was much richer than he really was, and that he had no need of any personal effort, any object in life, aside from the pursuit of pleasure. Ben's mother had died when he was 15 years old, and his father had never married again. Yet it was not any allegiance to her memory which had kept Anson English from a second marriage. He remembered her, to be sure, and scarcely a day passed without his mentioning her. But after her death, as during her weary life, he used her name as a synonym for all that was undesirable. He compared everybody to Lisbeth, and always to her disadvantage. He had a word of praise and encouragement and approval for every housewife in the neighborhood except his own. Whatever went wrong, indoors or out, Lisbeth was the direct or indirect cause. During the first 5 years of her married life, Elizabeth made strenuous exertions to please her husband. She wept her sweet eyes dim over her repeated failures. Then she found that she had been attempting an impossible labor, and grew passively indifferent, an indifference which lasted until death kindly released her. Elizabeth had been a tidy housekeeper during these first years. You'd scrub and scour a man out of her house and home, was all the praise her husband gave her for her order and cleanliness. And to his neighbors, to whom he was fond of paying informal visits, he would often say, "'Lizbeth's at it again, sweepin' and cleanin', so I cleared out. Never see her without a broom in her hand. I'd a good deal rather have a little more dirt than so much tearin' round. 'Lizbeth tires me with her ways." Yet, when in the indifference of despair which seized upon Elizabeth before her death, she allowed her house to look after itself, Anson was no better satisfied. "I've come over to find a place to set down," he would tell his neighbors. "Lizbeth's let things 'cumulate till the house is a sight to see. She's getting dreadful slack, somehow. A man likes order when he goes home to rest from all his cares." Even when she died, she displeased him by choosing a busy season for the occasion. "Just like 'Lizbeth to die in hayin' time," he said. "Everything got to stop, hay spoilin', men idle. Women never seem to have no system about work matters, no power of plannin' things to make it convenient like for men folks." Yet after she was gone, Anson found how much help she had been to him, how wonderful her economy had been, how light her expenditures. He knew he could never find anyone to replace her in these respects, and as money considerations were the main ones in his mind, he believed it would be the better economy to remain a widower and hire his work done. So, during those most critical years of Ben's life, he had been without a woman's guidance or care. At 18, he was all that arrogance, conceit, selfishness, and high temper could render him. Yet he was a favorite with the fair sex for all that, as he had a manly figure and a warm, caressing way when he chose, that won their admiration and pleased their vanity. Anson English favored early marriages, and began to think it would be better all around if Ben should bring a wife home. She could do the work better than hired help, and keep the money all in the family, and Ben would not waste his time and means on half a dozen, as he was now doing, but would stay at home, no doubt, and settle down into a sensible, practical business man. Yes, Ben ought to marry, and his father told him so. Ben smiled. "I'm already thinking of it," he said. He had expected opposition from his father, and was surprised at his suggestion. "Yes," continued the old man, as Ben already designated him, "I'd like to see you settle down before you're 21, but you want to make a good choice. There's Abby Wilson now. She got the muscle of a man and ain't afraid of anything, and her father has a fine property, a growin' property. Abby'll make a man a good, vigorous helpmate, and she'll bring him money in time. You'd better shine up to Abby, Ben." Ben gave a contemptuous laugh. "I'd as soon marry a dressed-up boy," he said. "She's more like a boy than a girl in her looks and in her ways. I have other plans in my mind, father, more to my taste. I mean to marry Edith Gilman, if she'll take me, and I think she will." A dark frown contracted Anson English's brow. "Edith Gilman?" he repeated. "Why, that puny schoolma'am with her baby face and weak voice? I'll never help you to get a living, Ben. What are you thinking of?" "Of love, father, I guess. I love her, and that's all there is of it. And I shall marry her, if she'll take me, and you can like it or lump it as you please. She's a good girl, and if she's treated well all around, she'll make a good wife, and she's the only woman that can put the check rein on me when I get in my tempers. She'll make a man of me yet." "But she can't work," insisted the father. "She looks as white and puny as 'Lizbeth did the year she died." "She's overworked in the schoolroom. I mean to take her home and give her a rest. I don't ask any woman to marry me and be my drudge. I expect my wife will keep help." The old man groaned aloud. Ben's ideas were positively ruinous. If he married this girl, it would add to, not decrease, the family expenses. But it was useless to oppose. Ben would do as he pleased. The old man saw that plainly, and he might as well submit. He did submit, and Ben married Edith on his 21st birthday and brought her home. Part 2. Edith was a quiet little creature with a soft voice and a pale, sweet face and frail figure. She came up to Anson English when she entered the house and put her hands timidly upon his arms. "I want you to love me," she said. "I have had no father or mother since I can remember. I want to call you father, and I want to make you happy if I can." "Well, I'll tell you how," the old man retorted. "Discharge the hired girl and make good bread. That'll make me happy." And he laughed harshly. Edith shrank from his rough words, so void of the sympathy and love she longed for. But she discharged the girl within a week, and tried to make good bread. It was not a success, however, and the old man was not slow to express his dissatisfaction. Edith left the table in tears. "Another dribbler. Lisbeth was always crying just that way over every little thing," sighed the old man. Edith eventually conquered the difficulties of bread-making, and became a famous cook, but she did not please her husband's father any the better by this achievement. "You're always fixin' up some new sort of trash for the table," he said to her one day. "Dessert, is it you call it? 'Nough to make a man's patient desert him to see sugar and flour wasted so. Lisbeth liked your fancy cooking, but I cured her of it." "Yes, and you killed her too," cried Edith, for the first time since her marriage, losing control of her temper and answering back. "Everybody says you worried her into the grave, but you won't succeed so well with me. I will live just to defy you, if no more, and I'll show you that I'll not bear everything too." It was all over in a moment, and it was not repeated. Edith was kinder and gentler and more submissive in her manner after that for days, as sweet natures always are when they have once broken over the rules which govern their lives. Yet the old man always spoke of Edith as a virago after that. "She's worse than Elizabeth," he said, "and she had a temper of her own at times that would just singe things." Ben passed most of his evenings and a good part of his days at the village store. He came home the worse for drink occasionally, and he was absolutely indifferent to all the work and care of the farm and family. "She's just like Lisbeth," the old man said to his neighbors. "She don't make home entertainin' for her husband. But Ben isn't balanced like me, and he goes wrong. He's excitable. I never was. The right kind of woman could keep him at home." After a child came to them, matters seemed to mend for a time. So long as the infant lay pink and helpless in its mother's arms, or in its crib, it was a bond to unite them all. So soon as it began to be an active child, with naughty ways which needed correction, it was another element of discord. The old man did not think Edith capable of controlling the child, and Ben was hasty and harsh, and he did not like to hear the baby cry. So he stayed more and more at the store, and was an object of fear to the child and of reproach to the mother when he did return. They drifted farther apart, and the old man constantly widened the breach between them. They had been married 6 years, and the baby girl was 4 years old when Ben struck Edith a blow one day and told her to take her child and leave the house. In less than an hour she had gone, no one knew whither. "She'll come back, more's the pity," the old man said. "'Lizabeth, she started off to leave me once, but she concluded to come back and try it over again." But Edith did not come back. Months afterward they heard of her in a distant part of the state, teaching school and supporting her child. Ben applied for a divorce on the plea of desertion. Edith never appeared against him, and he obtained it. Part 3. 1 year from the time Edith left him, he married Abby Wilson. She had grown into a voluptuous, though coarse maturity, and was dashing in dress and manner. Her father had recently died, leaving her a fine property. She had always coveted Ben, and did not delay the nuptials from any sense of delicacy, but rather hastened the hour which should make him legally her own. The old man was highly pleased at the turn affairs had taken. After all these years, Ben was united to the woman he had chosen for him so long ago, and now surely Ben would settle down and take the care off his shoulders, shoulders which were beginning to feel the weight of years of labor. In truth, the old man was breaking down. He fell ill of a low fever soon after Ben's second marriage, and when he rose from his bed he seemed to have grown 10 years older. He was more childish in his fault-finding and more irritable than ever before. And this new wife of Ben's had little patience with him. She was not at all like Edith. She bullied him and frightened him into silence when he began to find fault with her extravagances. For she was extravagant, there was no denying that. She cared only for show and outward appearance. She neglected her home duties, and often left the old man to prepare his own food, while she and Ben dashed over the country, or through the neighboring villages, behind the blooded span she had insisted upon his purchasing soon after their marriage. Poor old Anson English! He was nearing his 60th year now, and he looked and seemed much older. Ben was his only earthly tie, and the hope and stay of his old age. And he was but a reed, a reed. His father saw that at last. Ben would never develop into a practical business man. He was unstable, lazy, and selfish, and this new wife seemed to encourage him in every extravagant folly, instead of restraining him as the old man had hoped. And some way Ben had never been the same since Edith went away. He had been none too good or kind to his father before that. But since then, well, when she went, it seemed to Anson that she took with her whatever of gentleness or kindness lurked in Ben's nature, and left only its brutality and selfishness. And strive as he would to banish the feeling, the old man missed the child. Ah, no, he was not happy in this new state of affairs, which he had so rejoiced over at the first. He grew very old during the next 2 years. Like all men who worry the lives of women in the domestic circle, he was cowardly at heart, and Ben's new wife frightened him into silent submission by her masculine assumption of authority, and her loud voice and well-defined muscle. He spoke little at home now, but he still paid frequent visits to his neighbors, and he remained firm in the Adam-like idea that Elizabeth had been the root of all evil in his life. "Yes, Ben's letting the place run down pretty bad," he confessed to a neighbor who had broached the subject. "Ben's early training wasn't right. 'Lizabeth, she let him do 'bout as he pleased. 'Lizabeth never had no notions of how a boy should be trained. He'd a come out all right if I'd a managed him from the start." Strange to say, he never was known to speak one disparaging word of Abby, Ben's second wife. Her harshness and neglect were matters of common discussion in the neighborhood, but the old man, who had been so bitter and unjust toward his own wife and Edith, seemed to feel a curious respect for this Amazon who had subjugated him. Or, perhaps, he remembered how eager he had been for the marriage, and his pride kept him silent. Certain it is that he bore her neglect, and later her abuse, with no word of complaint, and even spoke of her sometimes with praise. "She's a brave one, Abby is," he would say. "She ain't afraid of nothing or nobody. If she'd been a man, she'd have made a noise in the world." Ben drank more and more, and Abby dressed and drove in like ratio. The farm ran down, and debts accumulated, debts which Abby refused to pay with her money, and the old man saw the savings of a long life of labor squandered in folly and vice. People said it was turning his brain, for he talked constantly of his poverty, often walking the streets in animated converse with himself, and at length he fell ill again, and was wildly delirious for weeks. It was a high fever, and when it left him, he was totally blind and quite helpless. He needed constant care and attention. He could not be left alone even for an hour. Ben was seldom at home, and Abby rebelled at the confinement and restraint it imposed upon her. Hired help refused to take the burden of the care of the troublesome old man without increased wages, and Ben could not, and Abby would not, incur this added expense. Servants gave warning. Ben drank more deeply and prolonged his absences from home, and Abby finally carried out a resolve which had at first caused even her hard heart some twinges. She made an application to the keeper of the county poor to admit her husband's father to the department of the incurably insane, which was adjacent to the poorhouse. "He's crazy," she said, "just as crazy as can be. We can't do anything with him. He needs a strong man to look after him. Ben's never at home, and he has everything to look after anyway. He can't be broken of his rest. And the old man talks and cries half the night. I'm not able to take care of him. I seem to be breaking down myself, with all I have to endure. And besides, it isn't safe to have him in the house. I think he's getting worse all the time. He'd be better off, and we all would, if he was in the care of the county." The authorities looked into the matter and found that at least a portion of the lady's statements were true. It was quite evident that the old man would be better off in the county house than he was in the home of his only son. So he was taken away, and Abby had her freedom at last. "We are going to take you where you will have medical treatment and care. It is your daughter's request," they told him in answer to his trembling queries. "Oh, yes, yes. Abby thinks I'll get my sight back, I suppose, if I'm doctored up. Well, maybe so, but I'm putty old for the doctors to patch up. But Abby has a powerful mind to plan things, a powerful mind. 'Lizabeth never would have thought of sending me away. 'Lizabeth was so easy like. Abby ought to have been a man. She'd have flung things." So he babbled on as they carried him to the poorhouse. It was November, and the holidays were close at hand. Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year. Abby meant to enjoy them, and invited all her relatives to a time of general feasting and merrymaking. "I feel as if a great nightmare were lifted off my heart and brain, now the old man has gone," she said. "He will be so much better off, and get so much more skillful treatment, you know, in a place like that. They are very kind in that institution, and so clean and nice, and he will have plenty of company to keep him from being lonesome. We have been all through it during the last year, or else we never should have sent him there. It is really an excellent home for him." Part 4. It was just a year later when a delicate, sweet-faced woman was shown through the wards of that excellent home for the poor and unfortunate. She walked with nervous haste, and her eyes glanced from room to room, and from face to face, as if seeking, yet dreading, some object. Presently the attendant pushed open a partly closed door, which led into a small, close room, ventilated only by one high, narrow window. "This is the room, I believe," he said, and the lady stepped in and paused. The air was close and impure, and almost stifled her. On the opposite side of the room she saw a large crib with a cover or lid which could be closed and locked when necessary, but which was raised now. In this crib, upon a hard mattress and soiled pillow, lay the emaciated form of an old man. He turned his sightless eyes toward the door as he heard the sound of footsteps. "What is wanted?" he asked feebly. "Does anybody want me? Has anybody come for me?" "Oh, father, father!" cried the woman in a voice choked with sobs. "Don't you know me? It is I, and I have come to take you away home with me. Will you go?" A glow of delight shone over the old man's wasted face, like the last rays of the sunlight over a winter landscape. He half arose upon his elbow and leaned forward as if trying to see the speaker. "Why, it's Abby! It's Abby come at last!" he said. "You called me father, didn't you? And you was crying, and it made your voice sound kind of strange and broken like. But you must be Abby come to take me home. Oh, I thought you'd come at last, Abby. It seems a long, long time since I came away. You've never been to see me. No, nor Ben either. But you've come at last, Abby, you've come at last. Let me take your hand, daughter, for I can't see yet. They don't seem to help me here as you thought they would. And I'm so hungry, Abby. Do you think you could manage to get the old man a little something to eat before we start home?" The woman had grown paler and paler as she listened to these words, which the old man poured out in eager haste, like one whose thoughts and feelings long pent within himself for want of a listener now rushed forth pell-mell into speech. "He does not know me," she whispered. "He does not know me. Well, I will not undeceive him now. He is happy in this delusion. Let him keep it for the present." Then aloud she said, "You are hungry, father? Do you not have food enough here?" "Oh, I have my share, Abby, I have my share. But my appetite's varying, and sometimes when they bring it, I can't eat it. And then when I want it most, I can't get it. I'm one of many here, and I've been so lonesome, Abby. But then I know you'd come for me all in good time. And Ben, how is Ben, Abby? Does he want to see his old father again?" "Ah, Ben was a nice little boy, a nice little boy. But 'Lisbeth wasn't no kind of a mother for such a high-strung lad. And then he hadn't oughter married that sickly sort of girl that ran off and left him. Sakes alive, what a temper she had! It sort of broke Ben down living with her as long as she did. But he remembers his old father at last, don't he? And he wants to have me home to die. Ah, Ben has a good heart after all." "I must not tell him, I must not," whispered the woman as she listened. "Bitter to me as his deception is, I must let him remain in it." Then with a sudden bracing of the nerves and a visible effort she said, "Ben is away from home now, father. He will not be there to meet you, but you'll not mind that. I shall make you so comfortable. I want you at home during the holidays." So he went out from the horror and loneliness and gloom of the poorhouse to the comfortable home which Edith had provided for herself and child in the years since she left Ben. Ava was a precious little maiden of 9 now, wise and womanly beyond her years. So soon as Edith learned of the old man's desolate fate, she resolved to bring him home. Ava could attend to his wants during the day, while she was in the schoolroom, and the interrupted studies could be pursued in the evening. Or she could hire assistance if he were as troublesome as report had said. He had been a harsh old man, and had helped to widen the breach between her and Ben. But he was the father of the man she had married, and she could not let him die in the poorhouse, so she brought him home. "Don't I hear a child's voice?" he asked, as Ava came dancing out to greet them. "Who is it, Abby?" "Why, it's your own little granddaughter Ava!" cried the child, clasping his withered hand in her 2 soft palms. Don't you remember me? Mamma says you used to love me." Edith's heart stood still. Surely now he would understand. And would he be angry and harsh with her? The old man's face lighted. "Ah, I see, he said musingly. "Abby and Ben have taken the little one home. It must be Edith is dead. She was such a puny thing." Then turning his face to the woman who was guiding his faltering footsteps, he asked, "And is Edith dead?" "Yes," she answered quietly. "Edith is dead," and added, "to you," in a whisper. He must never be undeceived, she thought. It would be too severe a blow. The truth might kill him. And to Ava she said a little later, "Dear, your grandfather is very ill, and not quite right in his mind. He thinks my name is Abby, and you must not correct him or dispute any strange thing he may say." The journey left the old man very weak indeed, but he talked almost constantly. "It was so good of you, Abby, to take the little girl home," he would say. "But I knowed you had a good heart, and Ben too. He was fond of his old father, spite of his rough ways. It was a pooty lonesome, off there at that place, that institute where you sent me. Some folks says it was the poorhouse, but I knew better. Ben and you would never send me there. I s'pose it was a good place, but they had too many patients. Sometimes I was cold and hungry and all alone for hours and hours. Oh, it's good to be back with you, Abby. But why don't Ben come?" "Ben is away, father." "Oh, yes, business, I suppose. Ben'll turn out all right at last. I always thought so. And he sort o' outgrows 'Liz'beth's trainin'. But I hope he'll get back for Christmas. Somehow I've been thinking lately about the Christmas days when Ben was a little boy. We all us put something in his stockin' that night, no matter if 'twain't no more than a sweet cake. Sakes alive, how he prized things he found in his stockin' Christmas mornin's. I got to thinking about it all last Christmas out of that there institute, and I just laid and bawled like a baby. I was so homesick like. Seemed to me if I could just see Ben's face again, I'd ask nothing more of heaven. And now I think if I can just hear his voice again, it'll be enough. Do you think he'll get home for Christmas, Abby?" "I hope so, dear father, but I cannot tell," Edith answered softly, her heart seeming to break in her breast as she listened. She knew very well that Ben would not go across the street to see the father he had deserted, and that she would never send for him to come to her house to pay even a last visit of mercy. "What will I do? How can I explain to him when Christmas comes and Ben does not appear?" she thought. But the way was shown her by that great peacemaker who helps us out of all difficulties at last. Christmas Eve, the old man's constant chatter grew flighty and incoherent. He talked of people and things unknown to Edith, and spoke his mother's name many times. Then he fell asleep. In the morning he seemed very weak, and his voice was fainter. "Such a strange dream as I have had, 'Liz'beth," he said, as Edith put her hand on his brow and smoothed back the thin white hair. "Such a strange dream. I thought Ben had grown into a man, and had left me alone, all alone to die. I'm so glad to be awake and find it isn't true. How dark it is, and how long the night seems. Tomorrow is Christmas. Did you put something in Ben's stocking, 'Liz'beth? I have forgotten." "Yes," answered Edith, in a choked voice. "And it's getting colder, 'Liz'beth. Hadn't you better look after Ben a little? See if he's covered up well in his crib. You're so careless, 'Liz'beth. The boy'll take his death o' cold yet. And he's all I've got. He'll make a fine man if you don't spoil him, 'Liz'beth. But you ain't no real sense for trainin' a boy somehow. Is he covered up? It's a bitter bitter cold." "He is well covered," Edith answered. The old man seemed to doze again. Then he roused a little. "It's dawn," he said. "I see the light breaking. Little Ben'll be crawling out for his stocking pooty quick. I oughter had the fire made afore this, to warm his little toes. Strange you couldn't awake me, 'Liz'beth. You don't never seem to have no foresight." Then the old man fell back on Edith's arm, dead. End of section 20. Recording by Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 21 of A Budget Christmas Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Christmas Goblins by Charles Dickens. In an old abbey town, a long, long while ago, there officiated as sexton and gravedigger in the churchyard one Gabriel Grubb. He was an ill-conditioned, cross-grained, surly fellow who consorted with nobody but himself and an old wicker bottle which fitted into his large, deep waistcoat pocket. A little before twilight one Christmas Eve, Gabriel shouldered his spade, lighted his lantern, and betook himself toward the old churchyard, for he had a grave to finish by next morning. And feeling very low, he thought it might raise his spirits, perhaps, if he went on with his work at once. He strode along until he turned into the dark lane which led to the churchyard, a nice, gloomy, mournful place, into which the townspeople did not care to go except in broad daylight. Consequently, he was not a little indignant to hear a young urchin roaring out some jolly song about a Merry Christmas. Gabriel waited until the boy came up, then rapped him over the head with his lantern 5 or 6 times to teach him to modulate his voice. And as the boy hurried away, with his hand to his head, Gabriel Grubb chuckled to himself and entered the churchyard, locking the gate behind him. He took off his coat, put down his lantern, and getting into an unfinished grave, worked at it for an hour or so with right good will. But the earth was hardened with the frost, and it was no easy matter to break it up and shovel it out. At any other time this would have made Gabriel very miserable, but he was so pleased at having stopped the small boy's singing that he took little heed of the scanty progress he had made when he had finished his work for the night, and looked down into the grave with grim satisfaction, murmuring as he gathered up his things, "Brave lodgings for one, brave lodgings for one, a few feet of cold earth when life is done." "Ho, ho, ho!" he laughed, as he set himself down on a flat tombstone, which was a favorite resting place of his, and drew forth his wicker bottle. "A coffin at Christmas, a Christmas box, ho, ho, ho!" "Oh, ho, ho!" repeated a voice close beside him. "It was the echoes," said he, raising the bottle to his lips again. "It was not," said a deep voice. Gabriel started up and stood rooted to the spot with terror, for his eyes rested on a form that made his blood run cold. Seated on an upright tombstone close to him was a strange, unearthly figure. He was sitting perfectly still, grinning at Gabriel Grubb with such a grin as only a goblin could call up. "What do you here on Christmas Eve?" said the goblin sternly. "I came to dig a grave, sir," stammered Gabriel. "What man wanders among graves on such a night as this?" cried the goblin. "Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!" screamed a wild chorus of voices that seemed to fill the churchyard. "What have you got in that bottle?" said the goblin. "Hollands, sir," replied the sexton, trembling more than ever, for he had bought it off the smugglers, and he thought his questioner might be in the excise department of the goblins. "Who drinks Hollands alone, and in a churchyard on such a night as this?" "Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!" exclaimed the wild voices again. "And who, then, is our lawful prize?" exclaimed the goblin, raising his voice. The invisible chorus replied, "Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!" "Well, Gabriel, what do you say to this?" said the goblin as he grinned a broader grin than before. The sexton gasped for breath. "What do you think of this, Gabriel?" It's very curious, sir, very curious, sir, and very pretty," replied the sexton, half dead with fright. "But I think I'll go back and finish my work, sir, if you please." "Work?" said the goblin. "What work?" "The grave, sir." "Ah, the grave, eh? Who makes a grave at a time when other men are merry and takes pleasure in it?" Again the voices replied, "Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!" "I'm afraid my friends want you, Gabriel," said the goblin. "Under favor, sir," replied the horror-stricken sexton. "I don't think they can. They don't know me. Sir, I don't think the gentlemen have ever seen me." "Oh, yes, they have. We know the man who struck the boy in the envious malice of his heart because the boy could be merry and he could not." Here the goblin gave a loud, shrill laugh, which the echoes returned 20-fold. I am afraid I must leave you, sir," said the sexton, making an effort to move. "Leave us?" said the goblin. "Ha, ha, ha!" As the goblin laughed, he suddenly darted towards Gabriel, laid his hand upon his collar, and sank with him through the earth. And when he had time to fetch his breath, he found himself in what appeared to be a large cavern, surrounded on all sides by goblins, ugly and grim. "And now," said the king of the goblins, seated in the center of the room on an elevated seat, his friend of the churchyard, "show the man of misery and gloom a few of the pictures from our great storehouses." As the goblin said this, a cloud rolled gradually away and disclosed a small and scantily furnished but neat apartment. Little children were gathered around a bright fire, clinging to their mother's gown or gambolling around her chair. A frugal meal was spread upon the table, and an elbow chair was placed near the fire. Soon the father entered, and his children ran to meet him. As he sat down to his meal, the mother sat by his side, and all seemed happiness and comfort. "What do you think of that?" said the goblin. Gabriel murmured something about its being very pretty. "Show him some more," said the goblin. Many a time the cloud went and came, and many a lesson it taught to Gabriel Grubb. He saw that men who worked hard and earned their scanty bread were cheerful and happy, and he came to the conclusion it was a very respectable sort of world after all. No sooner had he formed it than the cloud closed over the last picture seemed to settle on his senses and lull him to repose. One by one the goblins faded from his sight, and as the last one disappeared, he sank to sleep. The day had broken when he awoke, and found himself lying on the flat gravestone, with the wicker bottle empty by his side. He got on his feet as well as he could, and brushing the frost off his coat, turned his face toward the town. But he was an altered man. He had learned lessons of gentleness and good nature by his strange adventure in the Goblin's Cavern. End of section 21.
Section 22 of A Budget of Christmas Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Giordano. The Song of the Star by Reverend C. H. Mead. Oh, boys, you can count me out on that. All I can get goes to my mother and sisters for Christmas. The speaker was a manly little newsboy, with good features, a clean face, and bright eyes. His clothes looked neat, though they were adorned with numerous patches. "But see here, Will, Christmas only comes once a year, and why shouldn't we fellers have our banquet as well as the silk stockings? What would they know about things going on in the world anyway, if we newsboys didn't supply 'em with papers? All in favor of having a banquet, hold up your hands." Up went a score of hands, some dirty, some clean, and some speckled, but Will's hand remained down. "See here, Will, what's the reason you won't stay by us?" The boy hesitated a moment and then said, "Boys, it's mighty close times up at our house. Fried chicken and pound cake don't come our way. Turkeys roost too high for us. And, well, boys, if you must know it, about the only good thing we kids have up there is our mother's love. See these patches? My mother put them on. See these stockings? My mother has been mending this same pair of stockings for more than a year, and she washes and irons them after I've gone to bed at night. Every stitch of mother's needle and thread is a stitch of love, and one night not long ago I opened my eyes and saw my mother's tears dropping on the sleeve of my coat at the same time she was putting the patch on this elbow. I tell you, boys, the best thing I've got in the world is my mother, and the best Christmas gift I ever had is my mother's love. If I had $1,000,000, I'd give them all to my mother in return for her love. No, no, boys, no banquet for me, as long as I know my mother is starving herself, that we children may have more to eat." "Well," replied one of the boys, "if I had a mother like that, maybe I'd feel the same way. But all we get at our house is a good licking from a drunken mother, and I'm going in for a square meal at Christmas if I never has another." The boys, gathered on the sidewalk by one of the parks, were suddenly startled by a cry, "Look out there!" and the next moment a runaway horse dashed into their midst. Little Will was knocked over and was soon carried into a neighboring drug store, all unconscious of what had happened. It was soon discovered that his arm was broken and his body bruised in a number of places. The moment he regained consciousness and found what had occurred, he said, "Take me to my mother. She will take care of me somehow, though this isn't exactly the kind of a Christmas gift I meant she should have. Say, boys, one of you go up to our house and tell her easy about this. Don't burst in sudden and scare her, but tell her it isn't dangerous, and, well, just tell her I love her." The boys wiped their eyes, and one of them said, "Well, this busts up our banquet, fellers. I'll go and tell Will's mother. And say, fellers, shan't I tell her we will give our banquet money to help her out at Christmas?" A hearty, "You bet we will," was the response, as Big Tom sped away to carry the news to Will's mother, while kind hands helped carry the injured boy to his home. It was a poor home into which he was born, but everything was as neat and tidy as could be. A woman stood at the door, and it needed but one glance to know that she was the mother of Will. Poverty and hunger had failed to rob her of her beauty, and there was an air of refinement about her that told of better days and happier surroundings. "Christmas hasn't come yet, mother," said Will, "but I have. Don't you worry, I'll come out of this all right, and we will have a good Christmas yet." The mother kissed him tenderly as she said, "No, I will not worry, so long as I have God and you and Josie and Maggie and Tot. When Christmas comes round, Will, it will be a good day, whatever it brings." "It will bring yer heaps of things, Mrs. Sandford," blurted out Big Tom, "for we fellers has given up having a banquet, and are going to give yer something that Will can't bring now. Don't yer worry a bit." And here the rough fellow burst into tears and rushed out of the house. A few more days, and then Christmas Eve came round, and a bright night it was. Will lay sleeping on the bed, his mother near by, pretending to read, but in reality using the dear old Bible as a shield to hide the tears that trickled down her cheeks. The mother was thinking, and thinking fast, too. It was only a little over 13 years since her father had closed the door in her face and told her never to return. The man she loved was not the fashionable fop her father had selected for her as a husband, and secretly she had given her hand to the man to whom long before she had given her heart. All went well until 3 years ago, when her husband died suddenly, and she found herself with no means and 4 children to take care of. Too proud to apply to her father for help, she struggled on as best she could, leaning hard on the God whom her mother had taught her to love. Her children were a comfort to her, for they had inherited the natural goodness of both their parents. Her tears now fell fast, for as she thought, she also listened to the voices of her 2 youngest children, who were standing over by the window together.
"Say, Maggie, does yer see dat bright star up there? I wonder if that is the star where the shepherd's seen. If it is, it seems to be looking right down at us. Maybe Jesus is in that star, and if he is, he won't forget us, will he?"
And Tot looked at Maggie as the latter said, "Jesus loved little children, Tot, when he was on the earth, and I guess he loves them yet. That's a very bright star. It must be the one that was seen by the shepherds at Bethlehem."
"I think so, too," said Tot, "and maybe Josie will hear some of dem good tidings while she is out. Oh, Maggie, Jesus must love Mother. She is so good, and I think he has sent that star to tell us to look out for good news."
And where was Josie all this time? The mother thought she had gone into a neighbor's, where she frequently went, and so felt no anxiety. Out in the streets of the big city, side by side walked plenty and poverty, wealth and wretchedness, happiness and hunger, gladness and grief. Some carried bundles in their arms, while others carried burdens in their hearts. Over all, the good God watched, and down upon all the bright star shone. But what is that? Suddenly on one of the streets the people stopped and listened. On the steps of a stoop leading up to a lighted mansion stood a little girl who looked like a bright angel from heaven. Far above, overhead, shone the bright star that Maggie and Tot had seen. It was their star, and it was her star, for Josie, too, had discovered it, and somehow felt that the star that had brought good tidings of great joy to the shepherds on Bethlehem's plains had come again, and to bring once more good tidings. She had mounted the steps to get nearer the star, and then all unconscious of the people, in a rich, sweet voice she sang, "I think when I read that sweet story of old, when Jesus was here among men, how he called little children as lambs to his fold, I should like to have been with him then. I wish that his hands had been placed on my head, that his arms had been thrown round me, that I might have seen his kind look when he said, 'Let the little ones come unto me.'" As she sang, her gaze was fixed on the star, and even her hands were lifted toward it. The people looked at her. An angel had appeared in their midst. Her face, her voice, her upturned eyes, her uplifted hands, held them spellbound, until someone looking up in the direction she pointed cried out, "See that star?" Heavenward went the gaze of the multitude, and once more there seemed to come to them a voice saying, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people." The face of Josie was illumined, and even the multitude that had gathered failed to alarm her. The star with its good tidings was over her head and in her heart as well. "Who are you, my child?" said a gentleman who had come up on the steps where she stood.
"Please, sir, I am Josie Sandford."
The gentleman gave a start and said, "Sandford? Josie Sandford? Pray, where do you live, Josie?" She told him, and in response to other questions, told of mother, brother, and sisters.
"Oh, sir, do you see the star? I am sure it has some good tidings for us at our house, and I must hurry home and tell mother all about it. Good-bye."
Away sped the child until she reached her home, and then entering the room quietly, she went up to her mother and said,
"Have you seen the star, mother?"
Maggie and Tot cried out,
"We've seen it! Come, mother, and look quick."
The mother went quietly to the window, and there beheld a star of wonderful brightness, and as she gazed, her face took on a new light, and into her heart came a great peace. The sleeping boy was awakened by the voices, and he too made his way to the window and looked at the star.
"At evening time it shall be light."
It had come, and something else had come too, for steps were heard on the stairs, followed by a knock on the door, on opening which, in came a company of newsboys, headed by Big Tom. They bore bundles and baskets, provisions and poultry, sunshine and sugar, toys and turnips, goodwill and grapes, cheer and celery, and things that no one but those who had lacked for them would ever have thought of. Big Tom was the spokesman for the happy company.
"If you're pleased, Mrs. Sandford," he said, "there's our banquet. We wasn't going to come until tomorrow morning, but when we got the things all together, we just couldn't wait any longer, so we brought 'em tonight. And if it isn't too soon, ma'am, we wishes you and Will and Josie and Maggie and Tot a Merry Christmas, doesn't we, boys?" "Indeed we does," responded the boys.
The faces of that mother and her children were a sight to behold. Smiles and tears greeted the boys, and the mother and her 3 girls had a kiss for each of them. Then Tot said,
"I knowed it! I knowed it! The star had Jesus in it, and I knowed he see Maggie and me looking up at it."
"Well, boys," said Mrs. Sandford, "you shall have your banquet, for I want you all to take Christmas dinner with us tomorrow." "Yes, boys, you shall all take dinner with Mrs. Sandford and her children tomorrow, but it must be at the home of her parents, and not here," said a gentleman who had not been noticed as he stood in the hallway. Mrs. Sandford started as the owner of the voice entered the room, and little Josie sprang toward him at the same moment. She resembled her mother, and was her namesake as well. The gentleman stretched out his arms toward Mrs. Sandford as he said to her, "Josie, can you forgive me for the harshness with which I drove you years ago from my door? God only knows how I have suffered, and for years I have hunted high and low for you, and have advertised time and again, but all was in vain, until tonight I saw your face and heard your voice once more, as my grandchild, Josie, stood singing on the steps and gazing at the star. In her I found you again, and oh, how your mother and I have prayed for this time to come." Long before he had finished, the daughter was in her father's arms once more, and the children were clinging to their new-found grandparent. The newsboys looked on in wonder, and suddenly little Tot ran to the window, and then cried out,
"Oh, Grandpa, the star is here yet, and it shines brighter than before."
and she threw a kiss up to the star. Christmas morning came, and found them all in a home of plenty. A chair that had long stood vacant at that table was once more filled, and near it were 4 other chairs for the new-found grandchildren. Was it a Merry Christmas, did you inquire? Just ask those newsboys who came at 2 o'clock if they ever had such a banquet before or since, or whether they ever saw a home in which the Star of Bethlehem shone with greater splendor. And over the earth the star still shines, and will continue to shine until all mankind shall yet have a Merry Christmas. End of section 22. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 23 of A Budget of Christmas Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tim Watkins. Indian Pete's Christmas Gift. The moon was just peeping over the pines as Peter Shivershy slunk down the road from the lumber camp into the forest. Pete did not present a surprisingly dignified appearance as he skulked through the clearing, but he was not a very dignified person even at his best. Most persons would have said, I think that Pete's method of departure was hardly appropriate for one who had been selected by the citizens of Carter's camp to go on an important mission. But Pete had his own reasons for his actions. He crept along behind the stumps and logs till he reached the forest. Then, as if the shadow gave him fresh courage and dignity, he drew himself upright and started at a sharp trot down the road toward the village. We have said that Pete had reasons for his conduct. They were good ones. In the first place, he was an Indian, not a noble son of the forest, such as Cooper loved to picture, but a mean, dirty, yellow-faced Injun, lazy and worthless, picking up a living about the lumber camps, working as little as he could, and eating and drinking as much as possible. Such was the messenger. The mission was worse yet. It was Christmas Eve. The snow covered the ground, and the ice had stilled for the time the mouth of the roaring river. It was Saturday night as well, and for some time past the lumbermen had been considering the advisability of keeping the good old holiday with some form of celebration suited to the occasion. The citizens of Carter's camp were not remarkably fastidious. They knew but one form of celebration, and they had no thought of hunting out new ones. The one thing needful to make a celebration completely successful was liquor. This they must have in order to do justice to the day. The temperance laws of Carter's were very strict. Not that the moral sentiment of the place was particularly high, but it had been noticed that the amounts of labor in whiskey were in inverse proportions. The more whiskey, the less labor. It was a pure question of political economy. The foreman had often stated that he would prosecute to the fullest extent of the law the first man caught bringing whiskey into camp. The foreman did not attempt, perhaps, to deny that his knowledge of the law was somewhat crude. He had forcibly stated, however, that should a case be brought before him, he would himself act as judge and jury, while his fist and foot would take the place of witness and counsel. There was something so terrible in this statement, coming as it did from the largest man in camp, that very little whiskey had thus far been brought in. Christmas had come, and the drinking element in Carter's camp proposed that Pete Shivershy, the Injun, be sent to town for a quantity of the liquid poison, that the drinkers might enjoy themselves. Bill Gammon found Pete curled up by the stove. He took him out of doors and explained the business in hand. Bill prided himself somewhat on his ability to get work out of Injuns. Pete muttered only, "All right." He took the money Bill gave him, and then slunk away down the road for the forest, as we have seen him. Bill felt so confident of the success of his experiment that he did not hesitate to inform the boys that Pete was dead sure to return. He would stake his reputation upon it. Pete was in a hard position. If he loved anything in this world, it was whiskey. If there was anything he feared, it was Bill's fist. The two were sure to go together. The money jingling in his pocket suggested unlimited pleasures, but over every one hung Bill's hard fist. He ran several miles through the forest, till turning a corner of the road, he came upon a little clearing. in which stood a small log house. Pete knew the place well. Here lived Jeff Hunt with his wife, a French woman, and her troop of children. Jeff was a person of little importance by the side of his wife, though, like all lords of creation, he considered himself the legal and proper head of the family, as well as one of the mainstays of society. His part of the family government consisted, for the most part, in keeping the house supplied with wood and water, and in smoking his comfortable pipe in the corner while his wife bent over her tub. Miss Hunt was the only woman near the camp, and so all the laundry work fell to her. Laundry work in the pine woods implies mending and darning, as well as washing and ironing, and the poor little woman had her hands full of work surely. It was rub, 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 day after day, over the steaming tub, with the children running about like little wolves, and Jeff kindly giving his advice from his comfortable corner. And even after the children were in bed at night, she must set up and mend the clean clothes. What a pack of children there were! How rough and strong they seemed, running about all day, all but poor little Marie, the oldest. She had never been strong, and now at last she was dying of consumption. She could not sit up at all, but lay all day on the little bed in the corner, watching her mother with sad, beautiful eyes. The brave little Frenchwoman's heart almost failed her at times, as she saw how, day by day, the little form grew thinner, the eyes more beautiful, the cheeks more flushed. She knew the signs too well, but there was nothing she could do. Pete was a regular visitor at Jeff's, and always a welcome one. His work was to carry the washing to and from camp. He came nearer to feeling like a man at Jeff's house than at any other place he knew of. Everyone but Mrs. Hunt and little Marie called him only Injun, but they always said Mr. Shivershy. The Mr. Shivershy of the little French woman was the nearest claim to respectability that Pete felt able to make. One night while carrying home the clothes, he dropped them in the mud. He never minded the whipping Bill Gammon gave him half as much as he did poor Miss Hunt's tears to think how her work had gone for nothing. As Pete came trotting down the road, Jeff stood in front of his house chopping stove wood from a great log. A lantern hung on a stump provided light for his purpose. Bill stopped from sheer force of habit in front of the house, and Jeff, glad of any chance to interrupt his work, paused to talk with him. "Walk in, Injun," said Jeff hospitably. "Your clothes ain't quite ready, but the woman will have 'em all up soon. Walk in." It suddenly came over Pete that this was his night for taking the clothes home, but his present errand was of far more importance than mere laundry work. "Me no stop. I'm going to town. Great work. Large business," by which vague hints he meant no doubt to impress Jeff with a sense of the dignity of his mission, and yet cunningly to keep its objects concealed. "Going to town, be ye? Great doing ter camp tomorrow, I s'pose. I'll be round if I can get away, but walk in, Injun, and get your supper, and see the women," and Jeff opened the door for Pete to pass in. The thought of supper was too much for Pete, and he slunk in after Jeff and stood in the corner by the door. The room was hardly an inviting one, and yet if Pete had been a white man, some thoughts of home, sweet home, must have passed through his mind, but he was only a despised Injun. A rough board table was laid for supper at one side of the room. In the corner little Marie lay with the firelight falling over her poor thin face. Pete must have felt as he looked at her like some hopeless convict gazing through his prison bars upon some fair saint passing before him. She seemed to be in another world than his. There seemed between them a gulf that could not be bridged. 3 of the larger children were sobbing in the corner, while the rest formed a sorrowful group about an old box in which were 2 or 3 simple plants frozen and yellow. Mrs. Hunt was frying pork over the hot stove. As she looked up at Pete, he noticed that she had been crying. Jeff was the very prince of host. He made haste to make Pete feel at home. "Set by Injun, so the boys is going to kinda celebrate tomorrow, be they?" But Pete felt that his mission must not be disclosed. "What matter is we kids?" he asked, to change his subject. "Oh, they're just a-yellin' about them flowers," explained Jeff. You see, they had been a-training some posies indoors against tomorrow. You know, tomorrow's Christmas, you see, and them kids, they had an idea that have some flowers for to decorate that corner where the little gal is. Little gals, when they ain't well, like sich things, you know. Pete nodded. He was not aware of this love of diminutive females, but it would not show very good breeding to appear ignorant. "Wall, you see," continued Jeff, "they keep the flowers away from the little gal, meaning to surprise her like. But jest this afternoon they get checked by the frost, and now there they be stiffin' stakes. It is kind of bad, ain't it? Especially is it's Christmas, too." "What Christmas?" put in Pete. "Oh, Christmas? Wall, it's sort of a day like. It's something like other days, and yet it ain't. But then, Injun, I don't suppose you would understand if I was to tell you." And Jeff concealed his own ignorance, as many wiser and better men have done, by assuming a tone too lofty for his audience. But Mrs. Hunt could explain, even if Jeff could not. She paused on the way to the stove with a dish of pork in her hand. "It is the day of the good Lord, Mr. Shivershee. It is the day when the good Lord, he was born, and when all people should be glad." But the little woman belied her own creed as she thought of little Marie and the dead flowers. I hardly think Pete gained a very clear idea of the day, even from Mrs. Hunt's explanation. It was, I fear, all Greek to him. "What flowers for?" he asked, as in response to Jeff's polite invitation. He sat by and began supper. "Wall, it's sort of idea of the women," explained Jeff. "Looks kind of pretty to see flowers round, you see. Kind of slicks up a room like. All these things here comes into keeping house, you see, Injun." With which broad explanation Jeff helped himself to a piece of pork. But Mrs. Hunt was bound to explain too. Her explanation was certainly more poetic. "It is the way we show our love for the good Lord, Mr. Shivershee. What is more beautiful than the flowers? We take the flowers, and with much love we place them upon the walls, and we make others happy with them, and the good Lord, who loves us all, he is pleased." But here, seeing the sobbing children and the frozen plants, she could not help wiping her eyes upon her apron. The little sufferer on the bed saw this action. Her voice was almost gone. "Never mind, Mamma," she whispered, but the beautiful eyes were filled with tears. But she knew that Mamma would mind, that she could not help it. Pete listened to all this attentively. Injun that he was. Of course he could not understand it all, and yet he could hardly help seeing something of the sorrow that the loss of the flowers had brought upon the family. He finished his supper, and then slunk out at the door again. Jeff followed him out. "Little gal ever get well?" asked Pete. "No, I don't suppose she will," answered Jeff. "There ain't no hopes held out for her. Makes it kinder bad, you see. Nice, clever little gal as ever lived, too. Stop in and get your clothes when you come back, will you?" "All right," muttered Pete as he trotted away toward the town. I wonder what Pete was thinking about as he ran through the forest. An Injun's thoughts on any ordinary subject cannot be very deep. Yet when one comes from such a scene as Pete had just witnessed, and with such sad eyes as Marie's haunt one all along a lonely road, even an Injun's thoughts must be worth noticing. Let us imagine what Pete's thoughts were as he shuffled mile after mile through the snow. The scene he had just left rose before his dull Injun mind. How kind Miss Hunt had always been to him. She was the only one that called him Mister. How queer it was that the children could cry because the flowers were killed. How little Marie had looked at him. Somehow Pete could not drive those sad eyes away. They seemed to be looking at him from every stump, from every tree. They were filled with tears now. Could it be because the flowers were frozen? It is no wonder that when at last the few lingering village lights came into view, Pete was wondering how he could help matters out. It was quite late, and most of the shops were closed. Only here and there some late workers showed a light. The bar rooms were open full blast, and as Pete glided down the sawdust street, it needed all the remembrance of Bill's fist to keep him from parting with a portion of the jingling money for an equal amount of good cheer. But the fist had the best of it, and he went straight on to the last bar-room. Suddenly Bill was right. Nothing but a miracle could stop him. But the miracle was performed, and when Pete least expected it. Pete knew better than to go into the front door of the bar-room. He knew how well he and all his race were protected by the government. It had been decided that no one should be allowed to sell liquor to an Injun, at least at the regular bar. If an Injun, however, could so far lose light of his personal dignity as to come sneaking in at the back door and pay an extra price for his liquor, whose business was it? Pete knew the way of bartenders. He had been in the business before. He did not go in at the front door where the higher-bred white men were made welcome, but slunk down an alley by the side of the building, meaning to go in the back way. There was no light in the store next the bar-room. It was a milliner's store and had been closed for some hours, but in the back room 2 women were working away anxious to finish a hat, evidently intended for some village belle's Christmas. Pete stopped in the dark alley for a moment to watch them. A man sat asleep in a chair by the stove, but the women worked on with tireless fingers. The hat was growing more and more brilliant under their quick touches. By their side stood a basket of artificial flowers and bright ribbons. It seemed to Pete that he had never before seen anything so beautiful. Here were flowers. Why could he not get some for the little sick girl? It was a severe struggle for the poor Injun out there in the dark alley. The thought of the thrashing he would receive on the one hand, and the sad eyes of Marie on the other. What could he do? But even an Injun can remember a kindness. It may have been a miracle, or it may have been just the outcropping of the desire to repay a kindness whichever an Injun is said to possess. At any rate, the eyes conquered, and Pete braved the fist of Bill. For fear that he should lose courage, he pushed against the door of the room and entered without ceremony. There was a great commotion, I can assure you. The idea of an Injun pushing his way into the back parlor of a milliner's shop was too much of a revolutionary proceeding to pass unnoticed. The women dropped their work with a little scream, while the men started from their chair with more violent attempt upon poor Pete. "What be ye after here, Injun?" he growled. "Hump yourself out of here. Get a-going." But Pete pulled out his money, at the sight of which the standing army of the milliner's store paused. Money has smoothed over many an outrage. It might perhaps excuse even such an action on the part of an Injun. "I want flowers," Pete said, pointing to the basket. "Give me flowers. I pay." "Oh, you want to buy some of them artificial flowers, do you? This is pretty time of night to come flower hunting, ain't it? Just pick out your flowers, and then climb out." And he held the basket out at arm's length for Pete to select. Pete took a great red rose and a white flower. There was not very much of a stock to select from, but Pete, with Injun instinct, selected the largest and gaudiest. "Them is worth about 10 shillings, figured up the merchant, taking the money from Pete's hand. Pete carefully placed the flowers in the pocket of his ragged coat and started for the door. The milliner's man, rendered affable by the most surprising bargain he had just made, naturally wished to retain the patronage of such a model customer. "Want anything in our line, Injun? Just call round and we'll please you. Only come a little afore bedtime when you come again." But Pete slunk out at the door and did not hear him. Pete's money was nearly gone, but he had a scheme in his head. He slunk in at the back door of the bar room and obtained his jug and what whiskey he could buy with the rest of his money. Then up the street he ran again, out of town, stopping only once at the pump to fill the jug to the top with water. Resolutely fastening in the stopper, and not even raising the jug to his mouth, he started for camp at his long, swinging trot with the jug in his hand. Mile after mile was passed over, and Pete did not stop till Jeff Hunt's cabin came in sight. Hiding his jug behind a log, he crept up to the window and looked in. The light was burning on the table while Miss Hunt sat nodding over her work. She had been mending the clothes so that Pete could take them back with him. Tired out, she had fallen asleep. The box of frozen plants still stood by the table. Pete grinned as he saw them, thinking of the great flowers in his pocket. Marie was asleep. Over her head were huge long clusters of moss with masses of ground pine and red berries. Pete stole to the door and went in. Miss Hunt woke with a start, but at sight of Pete smiled in her weary way. Pete made up his bundle of clothes and then pulled out the great red rose and the white flower. He laid them on the table with flowers for little gal, sick, make her think Christmas, good flowers, all color, no fade, no smell, no wear out. Then catching up his bundle, he slunk away without waiting for Mrs. Hunt's thanks. When Bill Gammon woke in the morning, he found the jug at the foot of his bunk, but Pete was nowhere to be seen. He had left the jug and fled. The Christmas celebration at Carter's was a very tame affair. Many were the curses showered upon Pete, and had that worthy been present, I doubt if even the thoughts of the famous miracle would have sustained him in the beating he would have received. But if Pete's conduct produced such a sad effect upon the festivities at Carter's, the joy is caused at Jeff Hunt's cabin made matters even. The glad Christmas sun, glad with the promise of the old story, came dancing and sparkling over the trees, and looked down in wonderful tenderness upon the humble cabin. The first bright beams fell upon the bed where little Marie was lying. They showed her the rose and the white flower nestling in the evergreens. The children came and stood in wonder before the rude flowers. How wonderful they were! Where could they have come from? The face of the little girl was more patient than before. The eyes seemed more tender and yet not so sad. Perhaps the glad sun, the same good sun that had looked upon that faraway tomb from which the stone had rolled, whispered to her, as it played about her face, how soon the stone would roll from her life, how soon she would forget all her care and trouble, and enter the land of sunshine and flowers. It may be that the good old Christmas sun even hunted out poor despised Pete, and told him something of his happiness. I am sure he deserved it. Let us hope so, at any rate. End of section 23. Recording by Tim Watkins.
Section 24 of A Budget of Christmas Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. My Christmas Dinner. It was on the 20th of December last that I received an invitation from my friend, Mr. Figgins, to dine with him in Mark Lane on Christmas Day. I had several reasons for declining this proposition. The first was that Mr. P. makes it a rule at all these festivals to empty the entire contents of his counting-house into his little dining parlor, and you consequently sit down to dinner with 6 white-waistcoated clerks let loose upon a turkey. The second was that I am not sufficiently well read in cotton and sugar to enter with any spirit into the subject of conversation. And the third was, and is, that I never drink Cape wine. But by far the most prevailing reason remains to be told. I had been anticipating for some days, and was hourly in the hope of receiving an invitation to spend my Christmas Day in a most irresistible quarter, the felicity of eating plum pudding with an angel, and, on the strength of my imaginary engagement, I returned a polite note to Mr. P., reducing him to the necessity of advertising for another candidate for Cape and turkey. The 21st came, another invitation to dine with a regiment of roast beef eaters at Clapham. I declined this also, for the above reason, and for one other, viz., that on dining there 10 Christmas days ago, it was discovered, on sitting down, that one little accompaniment of the roast beef had been entirely overlooked. Would it be believed? But I will not stay to mystify. I merely mention the fact. They had forgotten the horseradish. The next day arrived, and with it a neat epistle, sealed with violet-colored wax, from Upper Brook Street. Dine with the ladies at home on Christmas Day. Very tempting, it is true, but not exactly the letter I was longing for. I began, however, to debate within myself upon the policy of securing this bird in hand, instead of waiting for the 2 that were still hopping about the bush, when the consultation was suddenly brought to a close by a prophetic view of the portfolio of drawings fresh from boarding school, moths and roses on embossed paper, to say nothing of the album, in which I stood engaged to write an elegy on a Java sparrow. That had been the favorite in the family for 3 days. I rung for gilt-edged, pleaded a world of polite regret, and again declined. The 23rd dawned. Time was getting on rather rapidly, but no card came. I began to despair of any more invitations, and to repent of my refusals. Breakfast was hardly over, however, when the servant brought up, not a letter, but an aunt and a brace of cousins from Bayswater. They would listen to no excuse. Consanguinity required me, and Christmas was not my own. Now my cousins kept no albums. They are really as pretty as cousins can be, and when violent hands with white kid gloves are laid on one, it is sometimes difficult to effect an escape with becoming elegance. I could not, however, give up my darling hope of a pleasanter prospect. They fought with me in 50 engagements that I pretended to have made. I showed them the court guide, with 10 names obliterated, being those of persons who had not asked me to mincemeat and mistletoe, and I ultimately gained my cause by quartering the remains of an infectious fever on the sensitive fears of my aunt, and by dividing a rheumatism and a sprained ankle between my sympathetic cousins. As soon as they were gone, I walked out, sauntering involuntarily in the direction of the only house in which I felt I could spend a happy Christmas. As I approached, a porter brought a large hamper to the door. A present from the country, thought I. Yes, they do dine at home. They must ask me. They know that I am in town. Immediately afterward a servant issued with a letter. He took the nearest way to my lodgings, and I hurried back by another street to receive the so much wished-for invitation. I was in a state of delirious delight. I arrived, but there was no letter. I sat down to wait, in a spirit of calmer enjoyment than I had experienced for some days, and in less than half an hour a note was brought to me. At length the desired dispatch had come. It seemed written on the leaf of a lily with a pen dipped in dew. I opened it, and had nearly fainted with disappointment. It was from a stockbroker, who begins an anecdote of Mr. Rothschild before dinner, and finishes it with the 4th bottle, and who makes his 8 children stay up to supper and snapdragon. In macadamizing a stray stone in one of his periodical puddings, I once lost a tooth, and with it an heiress of some reputation. I wrote a most irritable apology, and dispatched my warmest regards in a whirlwind. December the 24th. I began to count the hours, and uttered many poetical things about the wings of time. Alack, no letter came. Yes, I received a note from a distinguished dramatist, requesting the honor, etc. But I was too cunning for this, and practiced wisdom for once. I happened to reflect that his pantomime was to make its appearance on the night after, and that his object was to perpetrate the whole programme upon me. Regret that I could not have the pleasure of meeting Mr. Paulo and the rest of the literati to be then and there assembled was of course immediately expressed. My mind became restless and agitated. I felt amidst all these invitations cruelly neglected. They served indeed but to increase my uneasiness, as they opened prospects of happiness in which I could take no share. They discovered a most tempting dessert, composed of forbidden fruit. I took down Childe Harold and read myself into a sublime contempt of mankind. I began to perceive that merriment is only malice in disguise, and that the chief cardinal virtue is misanthropy. I sat nursing my wrath till it scorched me, when the arrival of another epistle suddenly charmed me from this state of delicious melancholy and delightful endurance of wrong. I sickened as I surveyed, and trembled as I opened it. It was dated blank, but no matter, it was not the letter. In such a frenzy as mine, raging to behold the object of my admiration condescend, not to eat a custard, but to render it invisible, to be invited, perhaps, to a tart fabricated by her own ethereal fingers. With such possibilities before me, how could I think of joining a friendly party, where I should inevitably sit next to a deaf lady who had been, when a little girl, patted on the head by Wilkes, or my Lord North, she could not recollect which, had taken tea with the author of Junius, but had forgotten his name, and who once asked me whether Mr. Munden's monument was in Westminster Abbey or St. Paul's. I seized a pen and presented my compliments. I hesitated, for the peril of precariousness of my situation flashed on my mind, but hope had still left me a straw to catch at, and I at length succeeded in resisting this late and terrible temptation. After the first burst of excitement, I sunk into still deeper despondency. My spirit became a prey to anxiety and remorse. I could not eat. Dinner was removed with unlifted covers. I went out. The world seemed to have acquired a new face. Nothing was to be seen but raisins and rounds of beef. I wandered about like Lear. I had given up all. I felt myself grated against the world like a nutmeg. It grew dark. I sustained a still gloomier shock. Every chance seemed to have expired, and everybody seemed to have a delightful engagement for the next day. I alone was disengaged. I felt like the last man. Tomorrow appeared to have already commenced its career. Mankind had anticipated the future, and coming mince pies cast their shadows before. In this state of desolation and dismay, I called, I could not help it, at the house to which I had so fondly anticipated an invitation and a welcome. My protest must here, however, be recorded, that though I called in the hope of being asked, it was my fixed determination not to avail myself of so protracted a piece of politeness. No, my triumph would have been to have annihilated them with an engagement made in September, payable 3 months after date. With these feelings I gave an agitated knock. They were stoning the plums, and did not immediately attend. I rung. How unlike a dinner bell it sounded! A girl at length made her appearance, and with a mouthful of citron informed me that the family had gone to spend their Christmas Eve in Portland Place. I rushed down the steps, I hardly knew whither. My first impulse was to go to some wharf and inquire what vessels were starting for America. But it was a cold night. I went home and threw myself on my miserable couch. In other words, I went to bed. I dozed and dreamed away the hours till daybreak. Sometimes I fancied myself seated in a roaring circle, roasting chestnuts at a blazing log. At others, that I had fallen into the Serpentine while skating, and that the Humane Society was piling upon me a Pelion, or rather a Vesuvius of blankets. I awoke a little refreshed. Alas, it was the 25th of the month. It was Christmas Day. Let the reader, if he possess the imagination of Milton, conceive my sensations. I swallowed an atom of dry toast. Nothing could calm the fever of my soul. I stirred the fire and read Zimmerman alternately. Even reason, the last remedy one has recourse to in such cases, came at length to my relief. I argued myself into a philosophic fit. But unluckily, just as the Lethean tide within me was at its height, my landlady broke in upon my lethargy, and chased away by a single word all the little sprites and pleasures that were acting as my physicians, and prescribing balm for my wounds. She paid me the usual compliment, and then, "Do you dine at home to-day, sir?" abruptly inquired she. Here was a question. No Spanish inquisitor ever inflicted such complete dismay in so short a sentence. Had she given me a sphinx to expound, a Gordian tangle to untwist, had she set me a lesson in algebra, or asked me the way to Brobdingnag, had she desired me to show her the North Pole or the meaning of a melodrama, any or all of these I might have accomplished, but to request me to define my dinner, to inquire into its latitude, to compel me to fathom that sea of appetite which I now felt rushing through my frame, to ask me to dive into futurity and become the prophet of pies and preserves, my heart died within me at the impossibility of a reply. She had repeated the question before I could collect my senses around me. Then, for the first time, it occurred to me that in the event of my having no engagement abroad, my landlady meant to invite me. There will at least be the 2 daughters, I whispered to myself, and after all, Lucy Matthews is a charming girl and touches the harp divinely. She has a very small, pretty hand, I recollect, only her fingers are so punctured by the needle, and I rather think she bites her nails. No, I will not even now give up my hope. It was yesterday but a straw. Today it is but the thistledown. But I will cling to it to the last moment. There are still 4 hours left. They will not dine till 6. One desperate struggle, and the peril is past. Let me not be seduced by this last golden apple, and I may yet win my race. The struggle was made. I should not dine at home. This was the only phrase left me, for I could not say that I should dine out. Alas, that an event should be at the same time so doubtful and so desirable. I only begged that if any letter arrived, it might be brought to me immediately. The last plank, the last splinter, had now given way beneath me. I was floating about with no hope but the chance of something almost impossible. They had left me alone, not with my glory, but with an appetite that resembled an avalanche seeking whom it might devour. I had passed one dinnerless day and half of another, yet the promised land was as far from sight as ever. I recounted the chances I had missed, the dinners I might have enjoyed, passed in a dioramic view before my eyes, Mr. Figgins and his 6 clerks, the Clapham beef-eaters, the charms of Upper Brook Street, my pretty cousins, and the pantomime writer, the stockbroker, whose stories one forgets, and the elderly lady who forgets her stories. They all marched by me, a procession of apparitions. Even my landlady's invitation, though unborn, was not forgotten in summing up my sacrifices. And for what? 4 o'clock. Hope was perfectly ridiculous. I had been walking upon the hair bridge over a gulf, and could not get into Elysium after all. I had been catching moonbeams and running after notes of music. Despair was my only convenient refuge. No chance remained, unless something should drop from the clouds. In this last particular I was not disappointed, for on looking up I perceived a heavy shower of snow. Yet I was obliged to venture forth, for being supposed to dine out, I could not of course remain at home. Where to go I knew not. I was like my first father. The world was all before me. I flung my coat round me and hurried forth with the feelings of a bandit, longing for a stiletto. At the foot of the stairs I staggered against 2 or 3 smiling rascals, priding themselves upon their punctuality. They had just arrived to make the tour of Turkey. How I hated them! As I rushed by the parlor, a single glance disclosed to me a blazing fire, with Lucy and several lovely creatures in a semicircle. Fancy, too, gave me a glimpse of a sprig of mistletoe. I vanished from the house, like a spectre at daybreak. How long I wandered about is doubtful. At last I happened to look through a kitchen window, with an area in front, and saw a villain with a fork in his hand, throwing himself back in his chair, choked with ecstasy. Another was feasting with a graver air. He seemed to be swallowing a bit of paradise and criticizing its flavor. This was too much for mortality. My appetite fastened upon me like an alligator. I darted from the spot, and only a few yards further discerned a house with rather an elegant exterior, and with some ham in the window that looked perfectly sublime. There was no time for consideration. To hesitate was to perish. I entered. It was indeed a banquet hall deserted. The very waiters had gone home to their friends. There, however, I found a fire, and there, to sum up all my folly and felicity in a single word, I dined. End of section 24.
Section 25 of A Budget of Christmas Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Poor Traveler by Charles Dickens. Dickens' introduction to this story describes his going to Rochester on Christmas Eve, and seeing there a quaint old charity, which provided for the entertainment of 6 poor travellers, who not being rogues or proctors might receive gratis for one night lodging, entertainment, and 4d. each. In honour of the day, a special meal is provided for the travellers then in the charity. After the meal, when the travellers have gathered around the fire, Their entertainer gives them the reason for the unwonted feast as Christmas Eve, my friends, when the shepherds, who were poor travellers too, in their way, heard the angels sing, on earth peace, goodwill toward men. Then each traveller was invited to relate a story, and among those told was the following. In the year 1799, a relative of mine came limping down on foot to the town of Chatham. He was a poor traveller, with not a farthing in his pocket. My relative came down to Chatham to enlist in a cavalry regiment, if a cavalry regiment would have him. If not, to take King George's shilling from any corporal or sergeant who would put a bunch of ribbons in his hat. His object was to get shot, but he thought he might as well ride to death as be at the trouble of walking. My relative's Christian name was Richard, but he was better known as Dick. He dropped his own surname on the road down, and took up that of Doubledick. He was passed as Richard Doubledick, age 22, height 5'10", native place Exmouth, which he had never been near in his life. There was no cavalry in Chatham when he limped over the bridge with half a shoe to his dusty feet. So he enlisted into a regiment of the line, and was glad to get drunk and forget all about it. You are to know that this relative of mine had gone wrong, and run wild. His heart was in the right place, but it was sealed up. He had been betrothed to a good and beautiful girl, whom he had loved better than she, or perhaps even he, believed. But in an evil hour he had given her cause to say to him solemnly, "Richard, I will never marry any other man. I will live single for your sake." But Mary Marshall's lips, her name was Mary Marshall, never address another word to you on earth. Go, Richard, heaven forgive you. This finished him. This brought him down to Chatham. This made him Private Richard Doubledick, with a determination to be shot. There was not a more dissipated and reckless soldier in Chatham barracks in the year 1799 than Private Richard Doubledick. He associated with the dregs of every regiment. He was as seldom sober as he could be, and was constantly under punishment. It became clear to the whole barracks that Private Richard Doubledick would very soon be flogged. Now the captain of Richard Doubledick's company was a young gentleman not above 5 years his senior, whose eyes had an expression in them which affected Richard Doubledick in a very remarkable way. They were bright, handsome, dark eyes, what are called laughing eyes generally, and, when serious, rather steady than severe. But they were the only eyes now left in his narrow world that Private Richard Doubledick could not stand. Unabashed by evil report and punishment, defiant of everything else and everybody else, he had but to know that those eyes looked at him for a moment, and he felt ashamed. He could not so much as salute Captain Townsend in the street like any other officer. He was reproached and confused, troubled by the mere possibility of the captain's looking at him. In his worst moments he would rather turn back, and go any distance out of his way, than encounter those two handsome, dark, bright eyes. One day, when Private Richard Doubledick came out of the black hole, where he had been passing the last 48 hours, and in which retreat he spent a good deal of his time, he was ordered to betake himself to Captain Townsend's quarters. In the stale and squalid state of a man just out of the black hole, he had less fancy than ever for being seen by the captain, but he was not so mad yet as to disobey orders, and consequently went up to the terrace overlooking the parade ground, where the officers' quarters were, twisting and breaking in his hands as he went along a bit of the straw that had formed the decorative furniture of the black hole. "Come in," cried the captain, when he knocked with his knuckles at the door. Private Richard Doubledick pulled off his cap, took a stride forward, and felt very conscious that he stood in the light of the dark, bright eyes. There was a slight pause. Private Richard Doubledick had put the straw in his mouth, and was gradually doubling it up into his windpipe and choking himself. "Doubledick," said the captain, "do you know where you are going to?" "To the devil, sir," faltered Doubledick. "Yes," returned the captain, "and very fast." Private Richard Doubledick turned the straw of the black hole in his mouth, and made a miserable salute of acquiescence. Doubledick, said the captain, since I entered his Majesty's service, a boy of 17, I have been pained to see many men of promise going that road, but I have never been so pained to see a man determined to make the shameful journey as I have been, ever since you joined the regiment, to see you. Private Richard Doubledick began to find a film stealing over the floor at which he looked, also to find the legs of the captain's breakfast table turning crooked, as if he saw them through water. I am only a common soldier, sir, said he. It signifies very little what such a poor brute comes to. You are a man, returned the captain, with grave indignation, of education and superior advantages, and if you say that, meaning what you say, you have sunk lower than I had believed. How low that must be, I leave you to consider, knowing what I know of your disgrace, and seeing what I see. I hope to get shot soon, sir, said Private Richard Doubledick, and then the regiment and the world together will be rid of me. The legs of the table were becoming very crooked. Doubledick, looking up to steady his vision, met the eyes that had so strong an influence over him. He put his hand before his own eyes, and the breast of his disgraced jacket swelled as if it would fly asunder. I would rather, said the young captain, see this in you, Doubledick, than I would see 5,000 guineas counted out upon this table for a gift to my good mother. Have you a mother? I am thankful to say she is dead, sir. If your praises, returned the captain, were sounded from mouth to mouth through the whole regiment, through the whole army, through the whole country, you would wish she had lived to say, with pride and joy, he is my son. Spare me, sir, said Doubledick. She would never have heard any good of me. She would never have had any pride and joy in owning herself my mother, and would have always had, I know, but not. Spare me, sir. I am a broken wretch, quite at your mercy. And he turned his face to the wall, and stretched out his imploring hand. My friend, began the captain. God bless you, sir, sobbed Private Richard Doubledick. I have heard from Private Richard Doubledick's own lips that he dropped down upon his knee, kissed that officer's hand, arose, and went out of the light of the dark, bright eyes, an altered man. In that year, 1799, the French were in Egypt, in Italy, in Germany, where not. Napoleon Bonaparte had likewise begun to stir against England in India, and most men could read the signs of the great troubles that were coming on. In the very next year, when we formed an alliance with Austria against him, Captain Townsend's regiment was on service in India, and there was not a finer non-commissioned officer in it, no, nor in the whole line, than Corporal Richard Doubledick. In 1801, the Indian army were on the coast of Egypt. Next year was the year of the proclamation of the short peace, and they were recalled. It had then become well known to thousands of men that wherever Captain Townsend, with the dark, bright eyes, led, there, close to him, ever at his side, firm as a rock, true as the sun, and brave as Mars, would be certain to be found, while life beat in their hearts, that famous soldier, Sergeant Richard Doubledick. 1805, besides being the great year of Trafalgar, was a year of hard fighting in India. That year saw such wonders done by a sergeant major, who cut his way single-handed through a solid mass of men, recovered the colours of his regiment, which had been seized from the hand of a poor boy shot through the heart, and rescued his wounded captain, who was down, and in a very jungle of horses, hoofs, and sabres. Saw such wonders done, I say, by this brave sergeant major, that he was specially made the bearer of the colours he had won, and Ensign Richard Doubledick had risen from the ranks, sorely cut up in every battle, but always reinforced by the bravest of men, for the fame of following the old colours, shot through and through, which Ensign Richard Doubledick had saved, inspired all breasts. This regiment fought its way through the Peninsular War, up to the investment of Badajoz in 1812. Again and again it had been cheered through the British ranks until the tears had sprung into men's eyes at the mere hearing of the mighty British voice, so exultant in their valour, and there was not a drummer boy but knew the legend that wherever the two friends, Major Townsend with a dark, Bright Eyes and Ensign Richard Doubledick, who was devoted to him, were seen to go. There the boldest spirits in the English army became wild to follow. One day at Badajos, not in the great storming, but in repelling a hot sally of the besieged upon our men at work in the trenches, who had given way, the two officers found themselves hurrying forward, face to face against a party of French infantry, who made a stand. There was an officer at their head, encouraging his men, a courageous, handsome, gallant officer of 35, whom Doubledick saw hurriedly, almost momentarily, but saw well. He particularly noticed this officer waving his sword, and rallying his men with an eager and excited cry, when they fired in obedience to his gesture, and Major Townsend dropped. It was over in 10 minutes more, and Doubledick returned to the spot where he had laid the best friend man ever had, on a coat spread upon the wet clay. Major Townsend's uniform was open at the breast, and on his shirt were 3 little spots of blood. "Dear Doubledick," said he, "I am dying." "For the love of heaven, no!" exclaimed the other, kneeling down beside him, and passing his arm round his neck to raise his head. "Towton, my preserver, my guardian angel, my witness, dearest, truest, kindest of human beings, Towton, for God's sake!" The bright, dark eyes, so very, very dark now in the pale face, smiled upon him, and the hand he had kissed 13 years ago laid itself fondly on his breast. "Write to my mother. You will see home again. Tell her how we became friends. It will comfort her as it comforts me." He spoke no more, but faintly signed for a moment toward his hair, as it fluttered in the wind. The ensign understood him. He smiled again when he saw that, and, gently turning his face over on the supporting arm as if for rest, died, with his hand upon the breast in which he had revived a soul. No dry eye looked on Ensign Richard Doubledick that melancholy day. He buried his friend on the field, and became a lone, bereaved man. Beyond his duty he appeared to have but 2 remaining cares in life. 1. To preserve the little packet of hair he was to give Towton's mother, and the other, to encounter that French officer who had rallied the men under whose fire Towton fell. A new legend now began to circulate among our troops, and it was, that when he and the French officer came face to face once more, there would be weeping in France. The war went on, and through it went the exact picture of the French officer on the one side, and the bodily reality upon the other, until the battle of Toulouse was fought. In the return sent home appeared these words: "Severely wounded, but not dangerously, Lieutenant Richard Doubledick." At midsummer time, in the year 1814, Lieutenant Richard Doubledick, now a browned soldier, 37 years of age, came home to England invalided. He brought the hair with him, near his heart. Many a French officer had he seen since that day, many a dreadful night. In searching with men and lanterns for his wounded, had he relieved French officers lying disabled. But the mental picture and the reality had never come together. Though he was weak and suffered pain, he lost not an hour in getting down to Frome in Somersetshire, where Towton's mother lived. In the sweet, compassionate words that naturally present themselves to the mind to-night, he was the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. It was on a Sunday evening, and the lady sat at her quiet garden window, reading the Bible, reading to herself, in a trembling voice, that very passage in it, as I have heard tell him. He heard the words, "Young man, I say unto thee, arise." He had to pass the window, and the bright, dark eyes of his debased time seemed to look at him. Her heart told her who he was. She came to the door quickly, and fell upon his neck. "He saved me from ruin, made me a human creature, won me from infamy and shame. O God, forever bless him, as he will, as he will." "He will," the lady answered. "I know he is in heaven." Then she piteously cried, "But oh, my darling boy, my darling boy!" Never from the hour when Private Richard Doubledick enlisted at Chatham, and the private, corporal, sergeant, sergeant major, ensign, or lieutenant breathed his right name, or the name of Mary Marshall, or a word of the story of his life, into any ear except his reclaimers, that previous scene in his existence was closed. He had firmly resolved that his expiation should be to live unknown, to disturb no more the peace that had long grown over his old offences, to let it be revealed, when he was dead, that he had striven and suffered, and had never forgotten. And then, if they could forgive him and believe him, well, it would be time enough. time enough. But that night, remembering the words he had cherished for 2 years, "Tell her how we became friends. It will comfort her as it comforts me," he related everything. It gradually seemed to him as if in his maturity he had recovered a mother. It gradually seemed to her as if in her bereavement she had found a son. During his stay in England, the quiet garden into which he had slowly and painfully crept, a stranger, became the boundary of his home. When he was able to rejoin his regiment in the spring, he left the garden, thinking, was this indeed the first time he had ever turned his face toward the old colours with a woman's blessing? He followed them, so ragged, so scarred and pierced now, that they would scarcely hold together, to Quatre Bras and Ligny. He stood beside them, in an awful stillness of many men, shadowy through the mist and drizzle of a wet June forenoon, on the field of Waterloo. And down to that hour the picture in his mind of the French officer had never been compared with the reality. The famous regiment was in action early in the battle, and received its first check in many an eventful year, when he was seen to fall, but it swept on to avenge him, and left behind it no such creature in the world of consciousness as Lieutenant Richard Doubledick. Through pits of mire and pools of rain, along deep ditches, once roads, that were pounded and ploughed to pieces by artillery, heavy wagons, tramp of men and horses, and the struggle of every wheeled thing that could carry wounded soldiers, jolted among the dying and the dead, so disfigured by blood and mud as to be hardly recognizable for humanity, dead as to any sentient life that was in it, and yet alive. The form that had been Lieutenant Richard Doubledick, with whose praises England rang, was conveyed to Brussels. There it was tenderly laid down in hospital, and there it lay, week after week, through the long bright summer days, until the harvest, spared by war, had ripened and was gathered in, slowly labouring at last through a long, heavy dream of confused time and place, presenting faint glimpses of army surgeons whom he knew, and of faces that had been familiar to his youth. Dearest and kindest among them, Mary Marshall's, with a solicitude upon it more like reality than anything he could discern. Lieutenant Richard Doubledick came back to life, to the beautiful life of a calm autumn evening sunset, to the peaceful life of a fresh, quiet room with a large window standing open, a balcony beyond, in which were moving leaves and sweet-smelling flowers, beyond, again, the clear sky, with the sun full in his sight, pouring its golden radiance on his bed. It was so tranquil and so lovely that he thought he had passed into another world, and he said in a faint voice, "Townsend, are you near me?" A face bent over him, not his mother's. "I came to nurse you. We have nursed you many weeks. You were moved here long ago. Do you remember nothing?" "Nothing." The lady kissed his cheek, and held his hand, soothing him. "Where is the regiment? What has happened?" "Let me call you mother." "What has happened, mother?" "A great victory, dear. The war is over, and the regiment was the bravest in the field." His eyes kindled, his lips trembled, he sobbed, and the tears ran down his face. He was very weak, too weak to move his hand. From that time he recovered, slowly, for he had been desperately wounded in the head, and had been shot in the body, but making some little advance every day. When he had gained sufficient strength to converse as he lay in bed, he soon began to remark that Mrs. Townsend always brought him back to his own history. Then he recalled his preserver's dying words, and thought, "It comforts her." One day he awoke out of a sleep refreshed, and asked her to read to him, but the curtain of the bed, softening the light, which she always drew back when he awoke, that she might see him from her table at the bedside where she sat at work, was held undrawn, and a woman's voice spoke, which was not hers. "Can you bear to see a stranger?" it said softly. "Will you like to see a stranger?" "Stranger," he repeated. The voice awoke old memories, before the days of Private Richard Doubledick. "A stranger now, but not a stranger once," it said in tones that thrilled him. "Richard, dear Richard, lost through so many years, my name." He cried out her name, "Mary," and she held him in her arms, and his head lay on her bosom. Well, they were happy. It was a long recovery, but they were happy through it all. The snow had melted on the ground, and the birds were singing in the leafless thickets of the early spring, when those three were first able to ride out together, and when people flocked about the open carriage to cheer and congratulate Captain Richard Doubledick. But even then it became necessary for the captain, instead of returning to England, to complete his recovery in the climate of southern France, They found a spot upon the Rhone, within a ride of the old town of Avignon, and within view of its broken bridge, which was all they could desire. They lived there, together, 6 months, then returned to England. Mrs. Townsend, growing old after 3 years, though not so old as that her bright, dark eyes were dimmed, and remembering that her strength had been benefited by the change, resolved to go back for a year to those parts. So she went with the faithful servant, who had often carried her son in his arms, and she was to be rejoined and escorted home at the year's end by Captain Richard Doubledick. She wrote regularly to her children, as she called them now, and they to her. She went to the neighbourhood of Aix, and there, in their own chateau near the farmer's house she rented, she grew into intimacy with a family belonging to that part of France. The intimacy began in her often meeting among the vineyards a pretty child, a girl with a most compassionate heart, who was never tired of listening to the solitary English lady's stories of her poor son and the cruel wars. The family were as gentle as the child, and at length she came to know them so well that she accepted their invitation to pass the last month of her residence abroad under their roof. All this intelligence she wrote home, piecemeal as it came about, from time to time, and at last enclosed a polite note from the head of the chateau, soliciting, on the occasion of his approaching mission to that neighbourhood, the honour of the company of that man so justly celebrated, Captain Richard Doubledick. Captain Doubledick, now a hearty, handsome man in the full vigour of life, broader across the chest and shoulders than he had ever been before, dispatched a courteous reply, and followed it in person. Travelling through all that extent of country after 3 years of peace, he blessed the better days on which the world had fallen. The corn was golden, not drenched in unnatural red, was bound in sheaves for food, not trodden underfoot by men in mortal fight. The smoke rose up from the peaceful hearths, not blazing ruins. The carts were laden with the fair fruits of the earth, not with wounds and death. To him who had so often seen the terrible reverse, these things were beautiful indeed, and they brought him in a softened spirit to the old chateau near Aix, upon a deep blue evening. It was a large chateau of the genuine old ghostly kind, with round towers, and extinguishers, and a high leaden roof, and more windows than Aladdin's palace. The entrance doors stood open, as doors often do in that country when the heat of the day is past, and the captain saw no bell or knocker, and walked in. He walked into a lofty stone hall, refreshingly cool and gloomy after the glare of a southern day's travel. Extending along the 4 sides of this hall was a gallery, leading to suites of rooms, and it was lighted from the top. Still no bell was to be seen. "Faith," said the captain, halting, ashamed of the clanking of his boots, "this is a ghostly beginning." He started back, and felt his face turn white. In the gallery, looking down at him, stood the French officer, the officer whose picture he had carried in his mind so long and so far. Compared with the original, at last, in every lineament, how like it was! He moved and disappeared, and Captain Richard Doubledick heard his steps coming quickly down into the hall. He entered through an archway. There was a bright, sudden look upon his face, much such a look as it had worn in that fatal moment. "Monsieur le Capitaine Richard Doubledick," enchanted to receive him. "He has not remembered me, as I have remembered him. He did not take such a note of my face, that day, as I took of his," thought Captain Richard Doubledick. "How shall I tell him?" "You were at Waterloo," said the French officer. "I was," said Captain Richard Doubledick, "and at Badajos." Left alone with the sound of his own stern voice in his ears, he sat down to consider. What shall I do, and how shall I tell him? At that time, unhappily, many deplorable duels had been fought between English and French officers arising out of the recent war, and these duels, and how to avoid this officer's hospitality, were the uppermost thought in Captain Richard Doubledick's mind. His mother, above all, the captain thought. How shall I tell her? "Spirit of my departed friend," said he, "is it through thee these better thoughts are rising in my mind? Is it thou who hast shown me all the way I have drawn to meet this man, the blessings of the altered time? Is it thou who hast sent thy stricken mother to me, to stay my angry hand? Is it from thee the whisper comes, that this man did his duty as thou didst, and as I did, through thy guidance, which has wholly saved me here on earth. And that he did no more? He sat down, with his head buried in his hands, and, when he rose up, made the second strong resolution in his life, that neither to the French officer, nor to the mother of his departed friend, nor to any soul, while either of the two was living, would he breathe what only he knew. And when he touched that French officer's glass with his own, that day at dinner, he secretly forgave him in the name of the divine forgiver of injuries. End of The Poor Traveler.
Section 26 of A Budget of Christmas Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. The Legend of the Christmas Tree. Most children have seen a Christmas tree, and many know that the pretty and pleasant custom of hanging gifts on its boughs comes from Germany. But perhaps few have heard or read the story that is told to little German children, respecting the origin of this custom. The story is called The Little Stranger, and runs thus. In a small cottage on the borders of a forest lived a poor laborer, who gained a scanty living by cutting wood. He had a wife and 2 children who helped him in his work. The boy's name was Valentine, and the girl was called Mary. They were obedient, good children, and a great comfort to their parents. One winter evening this happy little family were sitting quietly round the hearth, the snow and the wind raging outside, while they ate their supper of dry bread, when a gentle tap was heard on the window, and a childish voice cried from without, "Oh, let me in! Pray, I am a poor little child, with nothing to eat and no home to go to, and I shall die of cold and hunger unless you let me in." Valentine and Mary jumped up from the table and ran to open the door, saying, "Come in, poor little child. We have not much to give you, but whatever we have we will share with you." The stranger child came in and warmed his frozen hands and feet at the fire, and the children gave him the best they had to eat, saying, "You must be tired too, poor child. Lie down on our bed. We can sleep on the bench for one night." Then said the little stranger child, "Thank God for all your kindness to me." So they took their little guest into their sleeping room, laid him on the bed, covered him over, and said to each other, "How thankful we ought to be. We have warm rooms and a cozy bed, while this poor child has only heaven for his roof and the cold earth for his sleeping place." When their father and mother went to bed, Mary and Valentine lay quite contentedly on the bench near the fire, saying, before they fell asleep, "The stranger child will be so happy tonight in his warm bed." These kind children had not slept many hours before Mary awoke and softly whispered to her brother, "Valentine, dear, wake and listen to the sweet music under the window." Then Valentine rubbed his eyes and listened. It was sweet music indeed, and sounded like beautiful voices singing to the tones of a harp. "O holy child, we greet thee, bringing sweet strains of harp to aid our singing. Thou holy child in peace art sleeping, while we our watch without are keeping. Blessed be the house wherein thou liest, happiest on earth to heaven the highest." The children listened, while a solemn joy filled their hearts. Then they stepped softly to the window to see who might be without. In the east was a streak of rosy dawn, and in its light they saw a group of children standing before the house, clothed in silver garments, holding golden harps in their hands. Amazed at this sight, the children were still gazing out of the window, when a light tap caused them to turn round. There stood the stranger child before them, clad in a golden dress, with a gleaming radiance round his curling hair. "I am the little Christ child," he said, "who wanders through the world, bringing peace and happiness to good children. You took me in and cared for me when you thought me a poor child, and now you shall have my blessing for what you have done." A fir tree grew near the house, and from this he broke a twig, which he planted in the ground, saying, "This twig shall become a tree, and shall bring forth fruit year by year for you." No sooner had he done this than he vanished, and with him the little choir of angels. But the fir branch grew and became a Christmas tree, and on its branches hung golden apples and silver nuts every Christmas tide. Such is the story told to German children concerning their beautiful Christmas trees, though we know that the real little Christ child can never be wandering, cold and homeless, again in our world, inasmuch as he is safe in heaven by his Father's side. Yet we may gather from this story the same truth which the Bible plainly tells us, that any one who helps a Christian child in distress, it will be counted unto him as if he had indeed done it unto Christ himself. Inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. End of section 26.
Section 27 of A Budget of Christmas Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Peace Egg by Juliana Horatia Ewing. Everyone ought to be happy at Christmas, but there are many things which ought to be and yet are not. And people are sometimes sad, even in the Christmas holidays. The captain and his wife were sad, though it was Christmas Eve. Sad, though they were in the prime of life, blessed with good health, devoted to each other and to their children, with competent means, a comfortable house on a little freehold property of their own, and one might say everything that a heart could desire. Sad, though they were good people, whose peace of mind had a firmer foundation than their earthly goods alone. Contented people, too, with plenty of occupation for mind and body. Sad, and in the nursery this was held to be past all reason. Though the children were performing that ancient and most entertaining play, or Christmas mystery known as the Peace Egg, for their benefit and behoof alone. The play was none the worse that most of the actors were too young to learn parts, or that there was very little of the rather tedious dialogue, only plenty of dress and ribbons, and of fighting with the wooden swords. But though Robert, the eldest of the 5 children, looked bonny enough to warm any father's heart as he marched up and down with an air learned by watching many a parade in Barrack Square and drill ground, and though Nicholas did not cry in spite of falling hard, and Dora, who took the part of the doctor, treading accidentally on his little finger and picking him up, still the captain and his wife sighed nearly as often as they smiled, and the mother dropped tears as well as pennies into the cap which Tom, as the King of Egypt, brought round after the performance. Many, many years back, the captain's wife had been a child herself, and had laughed to see the village mummers act the Peace Egg, and had been quite happy on Christmas Eve. Happy though she had no mother, happy though her father was a stern man, very fond of his only child, but with an obstinate will that not even she dared thwart. She had lived to thwart it, and he had never forgiven her. It was when she married the captain. The old man had a prejudice against soldiers, which was quite reason enough, in his opinion, for his daughter to sacrifice the happiness of her future life by giving up the soldier she loved. At last he gave her her choice between the captain and his own favor and money. She chose the captain, and was disowned and disinherited. The captain bore a high character, and was a good and clever officer, but that went for nothing against the old man's whim. He made a very good husband, too, but even this did not move his father-in-law, who had never held any intercourse with him or his wife since the day of their marriage, and who had never seen his own grandchildren. Amid the ups and downs of their wanderings, the discomforts of shipboard and of stations in the colonies, bad servants and unwanted sicknesses, the captain's tenderness never failed. If the life was rough, the captain was ready. He had been by turns, in one strait or another, sick nurse, doctor, carpenter, nursemaid, and cook to his family, and had, moreover, an idea that nobody filled these offices quite so well as himself. Withal, his very profession kept him neat, well-dressed, and active. In the roughest of their ever-changing quarters, he was a smart man, and never changed his manner from that of the lover of his wife's young days. As years went on and children came, the captain and his wife grew tired of traveling. New scenes were small comfort when they heard of the death of old friends. 1 foot of the dear old dull home sky was dearer, after all, than miles of the unclouded heavens of the south. The gray hills and overgrown lanes of her old home haunted the captain's wife by night and day, and homesickness, that weariest of all sicknesses, began to take the light out of her eyes before their time. It preyed upon the captain, too. Now and then he would say fretfully, "I should like a resting place in our own country, however small, before everybody is dead." But the children's prospects have to be considered. The continued estrangement from the old man was an abiding sorrow also, and they had hopes that, if only they could get home, he might be persuaded to peace and charity this time. At last they were sent home, but the hard old father still would not relent. He returned their letters unopened. This bitter disappointment made the captain's wife so ill that she almost died, and in 1 month the captain's hair became iron gray. He reproached himself for having ever taken the daughter from her father, to kill her at last, as he said. And thinking of his own children, he even reproached himself for having robbed the old widower of his only child. After 2 years at home, his regiment was ordered again on foreign duty. He failed to effect an exchange, and they prepared to move once more, from Chatham to Calcutta. Never before had the packing, to which she was so well accustomed, been so bitter a task to the captain's wife. It was at the darkest hour of this gloomy time that the captain came in, waving above his head a letter which changed all their plans. Now, close by the old home of the captain's wife, there had lived a man, much older than herself, who yet had loved her with a devotion as great as that of the young captain. She never knew it, for when he saw that she had given her heart to his younger rival, he kept his silence, and he never asked for what he knew he might have had, the old man's authority in his favor. So generous was the affection which he could never conquer, that he constantly tried to reconcile the father to his children whilst he lived, and when he died, he bequeathed his house and small estate to the woman he had loved. It will be a legacy of peace, he thought on his deathbed. The old man cannot hold out when she and her children are constantly in sight, and it may please God that I shall know of the reunion I have not been permitted to see with my eyes. And thus it came about that the captain's regiment went to India without him, and that the captain's wife and her father lived on opposite sides of the same road. The eldest of the captain's children was a boy. He was named Robert, after his grandfather, and seemed to have inherited a good deal of the old gentleman's character, mixed with gentler traits. He was a fair, fine boy, tall and stout for his age, with the captain's regular features and, he flattered himself, the captain's firm step and martial bearing. He was apt, like his grandfather, to hold his own will to be other people's law, and, happily for the peace of the nursery, this opinion was devotedly shared by his brother Nicholas. Though the captain had left the army, Robin continued to command an irregular force of volunteers in the nursery, and never was colonel more despotic. His brothers and sisters were by turn infantry, cavalry, engineers, and artillery, according to his whim. The captain alone was a match for his strong-willed son. "If you please, sir," said Sarah one morning, flouncing in upon the captain, just as he was about to start for the neighboring town, "if you please, sir, I wish you'd speak to Master Robert. He's past my powers." "I've no doubt of it," thought the captain, but he only said, "Well, what's the matter?" "Night after night I put him to bed," said Sarah, "and night after night does he get up as soon as I'm out of the room, and says he's orderly officer for the evening, and goes about in his nightshirt and his feet as bare as boards." The captain fingered his heavy mustache to hide a smile, but he listened patiently to Sarah's complaints. "It ain't so much him I should mind, sir," she continued, "but he goes round the beds and wakes up the other young gentlemen and Miss Dora, one after another, and when I speak to him he gives me all the sauce he can lay his tongue to, and says he's going round the guards. The other night I tried to put him back in his bed, but he got away and ran all over the house, me hunting him everywhere and not a sign of him, till he jumps out on me from the garret stairs and nearly knocks me down. 'I've visited the outposts, Sarah,' says he. 'All's well.' And off he goes to bed as bold as brass." "Have you spoken to your mistress?" asked the captain. "Yes, sir," said Sarah. "And Missus spoke to him, and he promised not to go round the guards again." "Has he broken his promise?" asked the captain, with a look of anger and also of surprise. "When I opened the door last night, sir," continued Sarah in her shrill treble, "what should I see in the dark but Master Robert a-walking up and down with the carpet brush stuck in his arm. 'Who goes there?' says he. 'You audacious boy,' says I, 'didn't you promise your mom you'd leave off them tricks?' 'I'm not going round the guards,' says he. 'I promised not, but I'm for sentry duty to-night.' And say what I would to him, all he had for me was, 'You mustn't speak to a sentry on duty.' So I says, 'As sure as I live till morning, I'll go to your pa,' for he pays no more attention to his ma than to me, nor to any one else." "Please to see that the bed is taken out of my dressing room," said the captain. "I will attend to Master Robert." With this Sarah had to content herself, and she went back to the nursery. Robert was nowhere to be seen, and made no reply to her summons. On this, the unwary nursemaid flounced into the bedroom to look for him, when Robert, who had hidden beneath a table, darted forth and promptly locked her in. "You're under arrest," he shouted through the keyhole. "Let me out!" shrieked Sarah. "I'll send a file of the guard to fetch you to the orderly room by and by," said Robert, "for preferring frivolous complaints." And he departed to the farmyard to look at the ducks. That night, when Robert went up to bed, the captain quietly locked him into his dressing room, from which the bed had been removed. "You're for sentry duty to-night," said the captain. "The carpet brush is in the corner. Good evening." As his father anticipated, Robert was soon tired of the sentry game in these new circumstances, and long before the night was half worn away, he wished himself safely undressed and in his own comfortable bed. At 12:30 he felt as if he could bear it no longer, and knocked at the captain's door. "Who goes there?" said the captain. "Mayn't I go to bed, please?" whined poor Robert. "Certainly not," said the captain. "You're on duty." And on duty poor Robert had to remain, for the captain had a will as well as his son. So he rolled himself up in his father's railway rug and slept on the floor. The next night he was very glad to go quietly to bed, and remained there. The captain's children sat at breakfast in a large, bright nursery. It was the room where the old bachelor had died, and now her children made it merry. This was just what he would have wished. They all sat round the table, for it was breakfast time. There were 5 of them, and 5 bowls of boiled bread and milk soaked before them. Sarah, a foolish, gossipy girl who acted as nurse till better could be found, was waiting on them, and by the table sat Darky the black retriever, his long curly back swaying slightly from the difficulty of holding himself up, and his solemn hazel eyes fixed very intently on each and all of the breakfast bowls. He was as silent and sagacious as Sarah was talkative and empty-headed. Though large, he was unassuming. Pax the pug, on the contrary, who came up to the first joint of Darky's leg, stood defiantly on his dignity and his short stumps. He always placed himself in front of the bigger dog, and made a point of hustling him in doorways and of going first downstairs. Robert's tongue was seldom idle, even at meals. "Sarah, who is that tall old gentleman at church, in the seat near the pulpit?" he asked. "He wears a cloak like what the Blues wear, only all blue, and is tall enough for a life guardsman. He stood when we were kneeling down, and said, 'Almighty and most merciful Father,' louder than anybody." Sarah knew who the old gentleman was, and knew also that the children did not know, and that their parents did not see fit to tell them as yet. But she had a passion for telling and hearing news, and would rather gossip with a child than not gossip at all. "Never you mind, Master Robin," said she, nodding sagaciously. "Little boys aren't to know everything." "Ah, then, I know you don't know," replied Robert. "If you did, you'd tell." "I do," said Sarah. "You don't," said Robin. "Your ma's forbids you to contradict, Master Robin," said Sarah, "and if you do, I shall tell her. I know well enough who the old gentleman is, and perhaps I might tell you, only you'd go straight off and tell again." "No, no, I wouldn't," shouted Robin. "I can keep a secret, indeed I can. Pinch my little finger and try. Do tell me, Sarah. There's a dear Sarah, and then I shall know you know." And he danced round her, catching at her skirts. To keep a secret was beyond Sarah's powers. "Do let my dress be, Master Robin," she said. "You're ripping out all the gathers, and listen while I whisper. As sure as you're a living boy, that gentleman's your own grandpapa." Robin lost his hold on Sarah's dress. His arms fell by his side, and he stood with his brows knit for some minutes thinking. Then he said emphatically, "What lies you do tell, Sarah!" "Oh, Robin!" cried Nicholas, who had drawn near, his thick curls standing stark with curiosity. "Mamma says lies wasn't a proper word, and you promised not to say it again." "I forgot," said Robin. "I didn't mean to break my promise, but she does tell you know what." "You wicked boy!" cried the enraged Sarah. "How dare you say such a thing? And everybody in the place knows he's your ma's own pa." "I'll go and ask her," said Robin, and he was at the door in a moment, but Sarah, alarmed by the thought of getting into a scrape herself, caught him by the arm. "Don't you go, love. It'll only make your ma angry. There, it was all my nonsense." "Then it's not true?" said Robin indignantly. "What did you tell me so for?" "It was all my jokes and nonsense," said the unscrupulous Sarah. "But your ma wouldn't like to know I've said such a thing, and Master Robert wouldn't be so mean as to tell tales, would he, love?" "I'm not mean," said Robin stoutly, "and I don't tell tales, but you do, and you tell you know what besides. However, I won't go this time, but I'll tell you what, if you tell tales of me to Papa any more, I'll tell him what you said about the old gentleman in the blue cloak." With which parting threat Robin strode off to join his brothers and sisters. After Robert left the nursery, he strolled out of doors, and peeping through the gate at the end of the drive, he saw a party of boys going through what looked like a military exercise with sticks and a good deal of stamping. But instead of mere words of command, they all spoke by turns, as in a play. Not being at all shy, he joined them, and asked so many questions that he soon got to know all about it. They were practicing a Christmas mumming play called The Peace Egg. Why it was called thus they could not tell him, as there was nothing whatever about eggs in it, and so far from being a play of peace, it was made up of a series of battles between certain valiant knights and princes. The rehearsal being over, Robin went with the boys to the sexton's house. He was father to one of the characters called the King of Egypt, where they showed him the dresses they were to wear. These were made of gay-colored materials and covered with ribbons, except that of the Black Prince of Paradine, which was black, as became his title. The boys also showed him the book from which they learned their parts, and which was to be bought at the post-office store. "Then are you the mummers who come round at Christmas and act in people's kitchens, and people give them money that Mamma used to tell us about?" said Robin. The boy hesitated a moment and then said, "Well, I suppose we are." "And do you go out in the snow from one house to another at night, and oh, don't you enjoy it?" cried Robin. "We like it very well," the lad admitted. Robin bought a copy of The Peace Egg. He was resolved to have a nursery performance, and to take the chief part himself. The others were willing for what he wished, but there were difficulties. In the first place, there were 8 characters in the play, and there were only 5 children. They decided among themselves to leave out the fool, and Mamma said that another character was not to be acted by any of them, or indeed mentioned. "The little one who comes in at the end," Robin explained. Mamma had her reasons, and these were always good. She had not been altogether pleased that Robin had bought the play. It was a very old thing, she said, and very queer, not adapted for a child's play. If Mamma thought the parts not quite fit for the children to learn, they found them much too long. So in the end she picked out some bits for each, which they learned easily, and which, with a good deal of fighting, made quite as good a story of it as if they had done the whole. They may have been wanting otherwise was made up for by the dresses, which were charming. Robin was St. George, Nicholas the valiant slasher, Dora the doctor, and the other 2 Hector and the King of Egypt. "And now we've got no Black Prince," cried Robin in dismay. "Let Darky be the Black Prince," said Nicholas. "When you wave your stick he'll jump for it, and then you can pretend to fight with him." "It's not a stick, it's a sword," said Robin. "However, Darky may be the Black Prince." "And what's Pax to be?" asked Dora. "For you know he will come if Darky does, and he'll run in before everybody else, too." "Then he must be the fool," said Robin. "And it will do very well, for the fool comes in before the rest, and Pax can have his red coat on, and the collar with the little bells." Robin thought that Christmas would never come. To the captain and his wife it seemed to come too fast. They had hoped it might bring reconciliation with the old man, but it seemed they had hoped in vain. There were times now that the captain almost regretted the old bachelor's bequest. The familiar scenes of her old home sharpened his wife's grief. To see her father every Sunday in church with marks of age and infirmity upon him, but with not a look of tenderness for his only child, this tried her sorely. She felt it less abroad, thought the captain. A home in which she frets herself to death is after all no great boon. Christmas Eve came. "I'm sure it's quite Christmas enough now," said Robin. "We'll have the peace egg tonight." So as the captain and his wife sat sadly over their fire, the door opened, and Pax ran in, shaking his bells, and followed by the nursery mummers. The performance was most successful. It was by no means pathetic, and yet, as has been said, the captain's wife shed tears. "What is the matter, mamma?" said Robert, abruptly dropping his sword and running up to her. "Don't tease mamma with questions," said the captain. "She is not very well and rather sad. We must all be very kind and good to poor dear mamma." And the captain raised his wife's hand to his lips as he spoke. Robin seized the other hand and kissed it tenderly. He was very fond of his mother. At this moment Pax took a little run and jumped onto mamma's lap, where, sitting facing the company, he opened his black mouth and yawned with a ludicrous inappropriateness worthy of any clown. It made everybody laugh. "And now we'll go and act in the kitchen," said Nicholas. "Supper at 9 o'clock, remember," shouted the captain. "And we are going to have real frumenty and Yule cakes, such as mamma used to tell us of when we were abroad." "Hooray!" shouted the mummers. And they ran off, Pax leaping from his seat just in time to hustle the Black Prince in the doorway. When the dining room door was shut, Robert raised his hand and said, "Hush!" The mummers pricked their ears, but there was only a distant harsh and scraping sound, as of stones rubbed together. "They're cleaning the passages," Robert went on, "and Sarah told me they meant to finish the mistletoe and have everything cleaned up by supper time. They don't want us, I know. Look here, we'll go real mumming instead. That will be fun." Nicholas grinned with delight. "But will mamma let us?" he inquired. "Oh, it will be all right if we're back by supper time," said Robert hastily. "Only of course we must take care not to catch cold. Come and help me get some wraps." The old oak chest in which spare shawls, rugs, and coats were kept was soon ransacked, and the mummers' gay dresses hidden by motley wrappers. But no sooner did Darky and Pax behold the coats, etc., than they at once began to leap and bark, as it was their custom to do when they saw any one dressed to go out. Robin was sorely afraid that this would betray them, but though the captain and his wife heard the barking, they did not guess the cause. So the front door being gently opened and closed, the nursery mummers stole away. It was a very fine night. The snow was well trodden on the drive, so that it did not wet their feet, but on the trees and shrubs it hung soft and white. "It's much jollier being out at night than in the daytime," said Robin. "Much," responded Nicholas with intense feeling. "We'll go wassailing next week," said Robin. "I know all about it, and perhaps we shall get a good lot of money, and then we'll buy 10 swords with scabbards for next year. I don't like these sticks. Oh dear, I wish it wasn't so long between one Christmas and another." "Where shall we go first?" asked Nicholas as they turned into the high road. "This is the first house," he said. "We'll act there." And all pressed in as quickly as possible. Once safe within the grounds, they shouldered their sticks and marched with composure. "You're going to the front door," said Nicholas. "Mummers ought to go to the back." "We don't know where it is," said Robin, and he rang the front door bell. There was a pause, Then lights shone, steps were heard, and at last a sound of much unbarring, unbolting, and unlocking. It might have been a prison. Then the door was opened by an elderly, timid-looking woman who held a tallow candle above her head. "Who's there?" she said, "at this time of night?" "We're Christmas mummers," said Robin stoutly. "We didn't know the way to the back door, but—" "And don't you know any better than to come here?" said the woman. "Be off with you as fast as you can." "You're only the servant," said Robin. "Go and ask your master and mistress if they wouldn't like to see us act. We do it very well." "You impudent boy, be off with you," repeated the woman. "Master no more let you nor any other such rubbish set foot in this house." "Woman!" shouted a voice close behind her, which made her start as if she had been shot. "Who authorizes you to say what your master will or will not do before you've asked him? The boy is right. You are the servant, and it is not your business to choose for me whom I shall or shall not see." "I meant no harm, sir, I'm sure," said the housekeeper, "but I thought you'd never—" "My good woman," said the master, "if I had wanted somebody to think for me, you're the last person I should have employed. I hire you to obey orders, not to think." "I'm sure, sir," said the housekeeper, whose only form of argument was reiteration, "I never thought you would have seen them." "Then you were wrong," shouted the master. "I will see them. Bring them in." He was a tall, gaunt old man, and Robin stared at him for some minutes, wondering where he could have seen somebody very like him. At last he remembered it was the old gentleman of the blue cloak. The children threw off their wraps, the housekeeper helping them, and chattering ceaselessly from sheer nervousness. "Well, to be sure," she said, "their dresses are pretty, too, and they seem quite a better sort of children. They talk quite genteel. I might have known they weren't like common mummers, but I was so flustered hearing the bell go so late, and—" "Are they ready?" said the old man, who had stood like a ghost in the dim light of the flaring tallow candle, grimly watching the proceedings. "Yes, sir. Shall I take them to the kitchen, sir?" "For you and the other idle hussies to gape and grin at? No. Bring them to the library," he snapped, and then stalked off, leading the way. The housekeeper accordingly led them to the library and then withdrew, nearly falling on her face as she left the room by stumbling over Darky, who slipped in last like a black shadow. The old man was seated in a carved oak chair by the fire. "I never said the dogs were to come in," he said. "But we can't do without them, please," said Robin boldly. "You see, there are 8 people in the peace egg, and there are only 5 of us, and so Darky has to be the Black Prince, and Pax has to be the Fool, and so we have to have them." 5 and 2 makes 7, said the old man with a grim smile. "What do you do for the 8th?" "Oh, that's the little one at the end," said Robin confidently. "Mamma said we weren't to mention him, but I think that's because we're children. You're grown up, you know, so I'll show you the book and you can see for yourself." He went on, drawing the peace egg from his pocket. "There, that's the picture of him on the last page, black with horns and a tail." The old man's stern face relaxed into a broad smile as he examined the grotesque woodcut. But when he turned to the first page, the smile vanished in a deep frown, and his eyes shone like hot coals with anger. He had seen Robin's name. "Who sent you here?" he asked in a hoarse voice. "Speak, and speak the truth. Did your mother send you here?" Robin thought the old man was angry with him for playing truant. He said slowly, "No, she didn't exactly send us, but I don't think she'll mind our having come if we get back in time for supper. Mamma never forbid our going mumming, you know." "I don't suppose she ever thought of it," Nicholas said candidly, wagging his curly head from side to side. "She knows we're mummers," said Robin, "for she helped us. When we were abroad, she used to tell us about the mummers acting at Christmas when she was a little girl, and so we thought we'd be mummers, and so we acted to Papa and Mamma, and so we thought we'd act to the maids, but they were cleaning the passages, and so we thought we'd really go mumming, and we've got several other houses to go to before supper time. We'd better begin, I think," said Robin, and without more ado he began to march round and round, raising his sword, and the performance went off quite as creditably as before. As the children acted, the old man's anger wore off. He watched them with an interest he could not repress. When Nicholas took some hard thwacks from Robert without flinching, the old man clapped his hands, and after the encounter was over, he said he would not have had the dogs excluded on any consideration. It was just at the end, when they were all marching round and round, holding on by each other's swords over the shoulder and singing, "A mumming we will go," etc., that Nicholas suddenly brought the circle to a standstill by stopping dead short and staring up at the wall before him. "What are you stopping for?" said Robert, turning indignantly around. "Look there!" cried Nicholas, pointing to a little painting which hung above the old man's head. Robin looked and said abruptly, "It's Dora." "Which is Dora?" asked the old man in a strange, sharp tone. "Here she is," said Robin and Nicholas in one breath as they dragged her forward. "She's the doctor," said Robin, "and you can't see her face for her things. Dor, take off your cap and pull back that hood. There, oh, it is like her." It was the portrait of her mother as a child, but of this the nursery mummers knew nothing. The old man looked as the peaked cap and hood fell away from Dora's face and fair curls, and then he uttered a sharp cry and buried his head upon his hands. The boys stood stupefied, but Dora ran up to him, and putting her little hands on his arms, said in childish, pitying tones, "Oh, I am sorry. Have you got a headache? May Robin put the shovel in the fire for you? Mamma has hot shovels for her headaches." And though the old man did not speak or move, she went on coaxing him and stroking his head, on which the hair was white. At this moment Pax took one of his unexpected runs and jumped on to the old man's knee, in his own particular fashion, and then yawned at the company. The old man was startled and lifted his face suddenly. It was wet with tears. "Why, you're crying!" exclaimed the children with one breath. "It's very odd," said Robin fretfully. "I can't think what's the matter tonight. Mamma was crying too when we were acting, and Papa said we weren't to tease her with questions, and he kissed her hand, and I kissed her hand too, and Papa said we must all be very good and kind to poor dear Mamma, and so I mean to be. She's so good. And I think we'd better go home, or perhaps she'll be frightened," Robin added. "She's so good, is she?" asked the man. He had put Pax off his knee and taken Dora on to it. "Oh, isn't she?" said Nicholas, swaying his curly head from side to side as usual. "She's always good," said Robin emphatically, "and so's Papa. But I'm always doing something I oughtn't to," he added slowly. "But then, I don't pretend to obey Sarah. I don't care a fig for Sarah, and I won't obey any woman but Mamma." "Who's Sarah?" asked the grandfather. "She's our nurse," said Robin, "and she tells— I mustn't say what she tells, but it's not the truth. She told one about you the other day," he added. "About me?" said the old man. "She said you were our grandpapa, so then I knew that she was telling you know what." "How did you know it wasn't true?" the old man asked. "Why, of course," said Robin. If you were our mamma's father, you'd know her and be very fond of her and come to see her. And then you'd be our grandfather, too, and you'd have us to see you and perhaps give us Christmas boxes. I wish you were," Robin added with a sigh. "It would be very nice." "Would you like it?" asked the old man of Dora. And Dora, who was half asleep and very comfortable, put her little arms around his neck as she was wont to put them around the captain's, and said, "Very much." He put her down at last, very tenderly, almost unwillingly, and left the children alone. By and by he returned, dressed in the blue cloak, and took Dora up again. "I will see you home," he said. The children had not been missed. The clock had only just struck 9 when there came a knock on the door of the dining room, where the captain and his wife still sat by the Yule log. She said, "Come in," wearily, thinking it was the frumenty and the Christmas cakes. But it was her father, with her child in his arms. The captain had many friends who knew of the sad estrangement between his wife and her father. Some of them were in church the next day, which was Christmas Day, when the captain's wife came in. They would have hid their faces but for the startling sight that met the gaze of the congregation. The old grandfather walked into church abreast of the captain. "They've met in the porch," whispered one under the shelter of his hat. "They can't quarrel publicly in a place of worship," said another, turning pale. "She's gone into his seat," cried a girl in a shrill whisper. "And the children after her," added her sister, incautiously aloud. There was now no doubt about the matter. The old man in his blue cloak stood for a few moments politely disputing the question of precedence with his handsome son-in-law. Then the captain bowed and passed in, and the old man followed him. By the time that the service was ended, everybody knew of the happy peacemaking and was glad. One old friend after another came up with blessings and good wishes. This was a proper Christmas indeed, they said. There was a general rejoicing. But only the father and his children knew that it was hatched from the peace egg. End of section 27. Recording by Lynette Geisel. End of A Budget of Christmas Tales.